And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to be here with everyone. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we have a very special guest tonight, and that is Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. Joseph, how are you?
I'm good, Daniel. Trusting the plan.
Where we go one, we go Fauci, right?
Yeah, we go Fauci.
I forgot my Fauci goggles.
I forgot my nose bag too. So
unbelievable. Joseph, I have to say, we have so many things to get into tonight. Off the top, I want to say you have a new book out, which is called The Tower of Babel Moment. That book, you use a large format on that book.
That's because Lulu messed up their website as only Bill Gates can mess up a website. And I tried to get this thing into a trade paperback format. And it just wouldn't do it. And I just finally gave up and said, oh, to heck with it. So it came out in this big kind of coffee table format. Fantastic. People actually liked it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, you know,
it looks
say
fun.
What you will, but it's a fun book. It's just a book I was planning to do for a long time. And I was sitting around here trusting the plan and, you know, eating my popcorn. And I decided I might as well take this time and do the fun book I've wanted to do for a while. So I did it. So there it is.
And you had just done the series of McCarthy books.
Right.
And those were very heavy duty and they exposed a lot. And even a Project Blue book came up in there, as we know, which is, I think, off the charts. And those books are just starting to sink in with how powerful they are. This book, it's interesting to me because this phrase, you used it before. I've actually seen you do lectures on the Tower of Babel moment. What is the significance of that?
Well, that phrase actually is not mine. It comes from Leonard Bernstein's Harvard Norton Poetry Lectures in 1973 called The Unanswered Question. And they're a series, the lectures are in 6 parts. You can go on YouTube and watch them, although I recommend people buy the DVDs and have them because I watch them at least once a year because they're so thought-provoking. But he uses that phrase in the first lecture, and the first time I heard it, it just stuck. And I tell people about that in that Tower of Babel book, that it's actually his phrase. And it's so perfect for describing what I think may have been going on in people's heads, back in the post-war period, that they were worried about precisely another such event happening. So I've kind of picked it up and used it constantly.
That's fascinating. And they would be looking at this kind of like other technology zooming around and figuring out that we weren't alone.
Right.
And looking at it and saying, harkening back to this story, you've pointed out the Tower of Babel moment literally and kind of esoterically when you look back. But it's a strange story in any case.
Oh, it's a very strange story. I mean, it's odd just from the biblical point of view, because in the Bible, every time that you have an intervention by God in human affairs, usually the story gives you some sort of moral reason for the intervention. The Tower of Babel is unique in that sense because there's no reason given for the intervention, except if you read the story, it says if they finish this thing, they'll be able to do whatever they imagine to do. They won't be restrained from doing it.
Yes.
And that's the reason for the intervention. It's like, okay, so somebody's afraid of this project being completed because these hairless monkeys are going to, mess up the cosmos somehow with it. And, so we got to go down there and stop them. And the way it stopped is asymmetrical warfare. You interfere with the communications so that the people involved in the project aren't able to finish it. It's kind of like that wonderful scene in C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, where you have this DARPA-like organization that all of a sudden gets there's kind of a magician figure in the story that casts the Babel spell, and they start babbling all this nonsense,
Right.
and no one can understand each other, so the whole project falls apart.
Right.
So it's classic asymmetrical warfare: interdict and interfere with communications. It's a very strange story when you stop and think about it.
It is. They're building a tower to the sky, and suddenly the gods show up, and they're no longer just one god; they are gods plural, and they reason among themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
So let us go down.
Yeah. So we got a different group operating all over.
We've got somebody going on there that doesn't fit in too well with the narrative of monotheism, but anyway, it's a strange story. And the book, I go into all of the pseudepigraphal traditions about the Tower of Babel because there's a lot of them. Sibylline oracles. It's talked about in Enoch. It's talked about in the Book of Jubilees. Then you've got, of course, versions of the story that are not even from that tradition. You've got the Sumerian Babylonian version. You've even got hints of it in the Mayan Popol Vuh. So there's all of these traditions about it. And when you start reading these traditions, that's where it really gets interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's clear, and from my point of view, these traditions, I take them as containing some sort of kernel of truth. Well, when you read some of these things, particularly the Book of Jubilees, it's very clear that they're talking about some sort of physics was involved with the project, because they talk about the thickness of heaven and trying to bore into it and discover what it's made out of, and so on and so forth. It's very weird stuff.
Wow.
And all of that in traditions associated with the original biblical story. So I'm thinking, well, where is this coming from?
Right.
So I think there were bits and pieces of this story that were fragmented and then handed down and finally recorded. But it's a fun book. Really
it sounds fantastic. I actually, when I think about the 20th century version of you bringing that in, it makes really a lot of sense, because when you think about the mentality, and we're looking at this a lot now because you have groups like the Navy and the CIA pushing this whole UFO narrative and the UFO threat narrative. And the fact that they want to push that so badly, and I've got articles here. This is the front of the New York Times now, Joseph. No longer in shadows, Pentagon's UFO unit will make some findings public. I can't wait for that. And we all know how they rolled this out through TTSA and all these various things.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, though, now, in the middle of the whole COVID op and all these things, now they want to talk about UFOs. Yeah.
Yes.
So they're positioning now. This is a backup op, or this is part of the whole thing?
I think it's part of the whole thing. But to me, Daniel, the problem is, and I think we discussed this privately, the problem I'm having is an epistemological one.
Right.
Because let's just look at the federal government's track record here. The first thing they sold us was a magic bullet. Okay. And on this is gone. And then they sold us Waco, which was to protect the children.
Yeah.
They've lied so many times. Then came 9/11 and that whole fracas. And now we've got the Fauci, Wuhan, Lieber, Bill Gates, coronavirus narrative, where the science flip-flops every day depending on what sort of political agenda they want to accomplish. I call it the magic virus. I mean, it can infect people at Trump rallies, but not protests, and churches, but not casinos. And, it's just, it's a magic virus. It does whatever you want it to do.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I'm not saying that people aren't dying from this thing. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that the narrative is so out of proportion and so self-contradictory. I mean, we've got doctors being censored because they come out and contest the idea that these ridiculous nose bags are going to protect us from the virus and complicate our health in other ways, know. The whole narrative is so bad. So my problem is epistemological. How, I'm wondering, does anyone who's been following all of this trust the government when it all of a sudden says, oh, we've got a special UFO study group? Well, they've had special UFO study groups since Blue Book.
Oh yeah.
And, and if you, this has been going on for a long time, that the government is now coming out and saying, oh yeah, we've got this. To me, I'm like, big deal. So what? Where are you getting these so-called videos? Are they vetted properly to make sure that they haven't been faked? Are we really looking at an extraterrestrial technology? Because like we've talked about so many times, that's a heck of a lot of money that went missing over several decades. And in my opinion,
21 trillion.
Yeah, well, that's just what we know about, I really think this thing started after World War II, and the amounts of money are so astronomical that the only thing I can think of that would be an explanation for it is exotic and very expensive technological research. Wow. So, if the government comes out tomorrow and says ET is here and we're talking with him or her or it or whatever, am I going to believe it? No, because I'm too skeptical and jaundiced at this point. They're going to have to offer some pretty irrefutable stuff if they're going to make this stick. And they can't even get the narrative on the virus right. So I'm not holding my breath, for whatever they might come out and say about ET. And if I'm of the opinion that if the government's saying ET is a threat, then it probably isn't. And if it says they aren't, it probably is.
It's the opposite rule.
It's the opposite rule. Yes.
I know what's going to change your mind though, because this upstanding citizen got behind it, and he's the Florida senator. His name is Marco Rubio. Joseph Rubio says UFOs, they're a threat. They're a threat.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah.
Now, forgetting about his neocon background for a second.
Well, look, my problem is the Rubio bubble bath. It's all of that stuff about his background that makes me wonder just how he got elected. Because that little bubble bath episode, to me, that's just a control file. It's an indicator that there might be something more there than meets the eye, and that they've got him, and he's going to put out whatever narrative that they want him to put out. So again, I'm dubious about Dubio Rubio. Well, that's what I've called him ever since he appeared on the stage. You can go back and listen to George Ann Hughes and the Bite Show, and I was calling him that then. But
he ran for president.
I know he ran for president and was quickly ushered off the stage by Mr. Trump. That was during those Republican primary meltdowns that he was serving. Jeb, yes. Oh, the 9/11 comment to me is still a classic.
Yes,
just left Jeb speechless.
That was the end of Jeb, actually. Yeah.
Well, yes, and and his statement about Senator Cruz and his father, and now all of a sudden Cruz is really on board. It makes you wonder.
Dropping
Yes, exactly. So Rubio, he can say whatever he wants to, but again, he's putting this out without any argument, without any demonstration that ET may be a threat. Okay. Right. Now, I happen to think it's very possible, because you can't read any of that ancient stuff and come away with the idea that these are our friendly space brothers.
Yes.
But by the same token, you've got other stories that indicate, well, they're not entirely hostile either. So, give us something, Senator Rubio, for why you're saying this. Give us a reason.
Well, let's look at a likely scenario. I absolutely agree with what you're saying there. They haven't produced anything. As a matter of fact, the videos they released came out on YouTube in 2007 originally.
Yeah, I know. I know. What's this big release business? I mean, I forget what the guy's name was that used to have the night vision goggles
Yes.
where, you know, he was seeing all sorts of stuff in the sky and told other people, and they're looking up there. Oh yeah, look at that. Isn't that interesting? And, you know, this has been going on, and the government's finally saying, yeah, there's stuff up there. Oh, really? You know, we've seen the space shuttle videos, STS-48 with the space shuttle Discovery, STS-81 with the space shuttle Atlantis, and all those funny little things
that's the real stuff.
Yeah, that's the real stuff right there. I mean, come on.
That's a lot better than the Tic Tac, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, this is being treated as news by the propaganda media, and you know, it's like, okay, where have you guys been for the last 50 years?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's
real about this.
Yeah.
It is. And every time I see that Christopher Mellon's involved, of the Mellon banker family with all their billions and all the rest, and that he worked for W and all that, you know, he works directly. He's part of the board of TTSA, and he always shows up in those New York Times articles. So that whole group of TTSA, they have over 100 years of CIA experience in their board. So we know where this story is coming from with those.
Sure.
Yeah, it's part of their op. What I do find interesting, and I'm going straight from this article here. U.S. Navy UFO Task Force exists, and Rubio wants to know its data on aerial phenomena threats. This is getting interesting to me because it seems to me that even if they're sort of been watching for years the UFO thing, they don't quite know what they're dealing with, let's say. They want to create their own version that will serve their purposes. That's where the UFO threat comes from. That's where this whole let's accept UFOs, because it was the top search on Google in 2018. They were probably like, there's no way around it anyway.
Right. Right. Well, I do think you're right that there's an aspect of prepping a narrative here.
Yeah.
That you know, we're seeing narratives being prepped all over the place. You know, the election is going to be a fraud, and this or that party is going to contest it. They're prepping so many things ahead of time, and I think this is one aspect of it. And again, I would not put it past them to try and stage something, and, you know, as a kind of interplanetary false flag op, because these people are desperate to have their global government. And really, at this stage, climate change hasn't worked out for them.
Yeah.
You know, this global pandemic, when you run the numbers, certainly isn't anywhere close to a pandemic.
Yeah, right.
And you know, they need something to stampede people into this globalist dream that they've had for, you know, at least a couple of centuries. So who knows? That may work, but at this point, I think there's too many people, Daniel, that have this epistemological problem with what they see. So they're gonna have to resort to a concerted media campaign. And, you know, my other problem is considering the sources. You know, most of the mainstream media has revealed itself as terribly partisan and with an agenda. So who's going to trust them, you know, if they come out and talk about all of this stuff?
Right.
And the other thing that is weird to me, Daniel, and this is why I think there's a bit of narrative preparation, is that conference or that interview, whatever you want to, weird thing that Trump's son did with his father.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, his son came right out and asked him, well, what do you know about ETs or Roswell or something? I don't remember what the exact question was, but it was right there in the interview.
Yeah.
And Trump's response was, well, I know a lot of things about it, but I can't talk about it.
Yeah.
And okay, well, what do you know? You know, and where is it coming from? Is this part of your UFO briefing that you get, you know, from the intelligence services, or is this coming via your uncle and the original swamp creature Roy Cohn? You know, so, and if anyone even suspects,
probably the latter.
I am thinking, it's probably all of that association that he had with Nixon and Roy Cohn, and, you know, that whole ilk, and you know, in Cohn's case, Cohn would have been in the perfect position, going back to the McCarthy books. Cohn would have been in the perfect position to know exactly what was in those transcripts because he was there in those Monmouth hearings. And he was the one, besides McCarthy, that did most of the heavy questioning.
Right.
in those hearings. And if anyone would be in a position to tell Donald Trump there's a heck of a lot more going on than meets the eye, it would be Roy Cohn.
Mhm.
So, Trump lets this out. And again, is he sending messages that he knows something, and he's sending a message that to the ET threat people, don't go there
Mhm.
because I can blow it out of the water? Or,
Right.
what's the message he's sending? But he is sending a message.
Yeah.
That question to occur in that interview had to have been planned. It was not accidental.
All right. They're not going to do anything spontaneous about aliens.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I'll tell you what makes me think it was planned is the very fact that it's his son doing the interview.
Right.
They wanted to make sure to get that on the record.
Yes.
So we're not trusting Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or anybody else. It's his son.
Yeah, exactly. And this really goes in with a lot of the things that we've talked about Trump's uncle. Because John Trump, being at MIT, he had Vannevar Bush as his mentor. Vannevar Bush ran the UFO file. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Vannevar Bush ran every. He was the Hans Kammler of American Black projects. I mean, he had his fingers into every little black project that was going on during the Second World War, and I'm quite convinced for a long period of time afterward. Mm-hmm. So, again, Trump has some interesting independent sources,
right,
that no other president coming in to office really had, with maybe the exception of John Kennedy, with that whole Kennedy McCarthy connection. So it's interesting that these are the two presidents that had that kind of independent ability to vet what the government agencies may have been telling them.
Right.
So, I'm intensely suspicious at this point of this whole UFO narrative that's coming out.
No question. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X Series 93 with Dr. Joseph Farrell. He's got a new book out. It is called The Tower of Babel Moment, and this is fascinating stuff. Joseph, I've been going through two books. One of the books that's interesting, you just mentioned Kammler. There's a book that came out called The Hidden Nazi, mm-hmm. which is about Kammler, and mm-hmm. had some details in there. Mm-hmm. But what I found so fascinating in looking at it, and it has come out in the last year or so, mm-hmm. but the work that you've tracked about Kammler, really, it mirrors a lot of that. And mm-hmm. you've been doing this over a decade. But one of the things that's so fascinating to me is Kammler, who was in charge of these kind of exotic projects, would have been in charge of the Bell Project mm-hmm. yes. in Nazi Germany, as you pointed out. In that book, they talk about as the war fortunes turn against Hitler, Kammler more and more has to try to either ship this stuff out mm-hmm. to save it or mm-hmm. pretend that he's destroying it, mm-hmm. whatever it happens to be. And it is in that sort of mire web of history that the Bell disappears into. Mm-hmm. So for people who don't know, can you tell them what the Bell is and what might have happened to it?
Well, the Bell is allegedly a super secret project in Nazi Germany. It was first thoroughly researched by a Polish researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski. And all researchers, myself included, Nick Cook, anybody who's talked about the Bell is at some point reliant on Igor Witkowski. Igor's book was called The Truth About the Wunderwaffe. It's a good book if you can find it. There is a Polish edition, but the English edition is very hard to come by. Fortunately, I was able to get a copy years and years ago. But the Bell Project, the way I've attempted to reconstruct it based on Igor's research and some additional material that I've outlined in the book, was, to my mind, Nazi Germany's attempt to find an energy source or physics that would allow them to do three things. The first would be so-called free energy or zero-point energy. The second would be for the purposes of anti-gravity, which allegedly the Bell demonstrated some of those properties by levitating when it was in operation. But that's all it did. It just levitated. It didn't buzz around like UFOs or anything like that.
Right.
Because it had to be cabled to the ground for immense electrical power. So it wasn't a functioning or deployable or operable device in a military sense. But I do think the third thing that they were wanting was that if you can find an energy source of that nature, then if you weaponize it, and I've said this many times, if you weaponize that energy source, you've got something that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So, these were the three aims, I think, of the Bell Project. There are people that dispute it, but I do think that Igor laid out such a detailed case that it's possible to go into that case and look at the details that he lays out and kind of reverse engineer the physics concepts that the Germans were thinking of when they deployed this device. So once you do that, then you can go out and look for confirmations in the scientific literature of the period. And I think it's very clear that this is what they were up to. That's the case I've tried to lay out in several books.
Do you think that the Bell represents torsion physics?
Yeah. Because it was the device that Igor describes is a typical plasma trap, but with the significant exception. A plasma trap is basically an electromagnetic device that creates a plasma and like a tokamak fusion reactor that holds the plasma in an intense electromagnetic field. But what the Nazis did was they started rotating that field and even set it up with mechanical rotation of the plasma inducing fuel in the structure. And then they were pulsing it, in my opinion, with gobs of direct current electricity. And the reason I say that is one significant little detail that Igor mentions, that the Germans nicknamed the bell Der Bienenstock, the beehive. So it made a harsh buzzing sound when it was in operation. And to me, that's a signature of the sound of an electromagnetic switch being opened and closed extremely fast so that it can pulse with all that direct current electricity. So it's little details like that and trying to reverse engineer them that I get up to in my books that talk about the bell. And the case that I make is circumstantial. People have to understand that. But it's a very, very detailed circumstantial case that, to my mind, when you add it all up, it's very clear that the Nazis were up to something on that line. And to add to that story, I talk about Dr. Ronald Richter down in Argentina doing his very weird fusion experiments, where he talks about rotating the plasma, pulsing it with gobs of electricity, which I'm assuming were direct currency electricity and so on. So in other words, I think there was a continuation of that project in Argentina.
Right, absolutely. Where did he get that knowledge?
Right.
It's interesting too, because on the record, the bell disappears.
Right.
You pointed out that we didn't know about it in society until 1990, when the two Germanys emerged, and we had one. That whole thing happened. Now that's pretty significant because it's a big missing chapter.
Oh, huge.
Yeah, for 45 some odd years.
Right.
So it's overwhelming that something happened to the bell. The idea that they would have destroyed it, backtracking through Comler and stuff, doesn't make sense. It seems like they got it out of there.
Yeah, I think they got it out of there. But even if they did destroy it, when you look at Ronald Richter's work in Argentina, which is just very weird, it's very clear that the same concepts are involved in what he was up to. Mm-hmm. So, they may have shipped the bell someplace else and decided to have several different centers researching it. It may have been destroyed. I don't know. I personally think that they got the dang thing out of there because it wasn't that big of a device. It was perfectly capable of being put in one of those large long-range transport aircraft that the Germans had at the time. So Kammler, I do think, yes, is a crucial figure here. But you mentioned the German reunification. This is the other thing that people have to get wrap their heads around. Virtually everything that is now being talked about with the Nazi secret weapons programs, from A-bombs to death rays to the Bell, all of this exotic weird stuff that they were doing, most of that has come out since the German reunification, including that very significant document that the Zinsser affidavit, that it looks very definitely like there was some sort of German A-bomb test in October of 1944. That was not declassified until 1992 by the Clinton administration. And it's, I read that thing and I thought, oh my God, what he's describing is the effect of a nuclear blast, and he's describing it before the details of a nuclear blast are publicly well known. And that's the fly in the ointment. So there's all sorts of stuff. And the German reunification is basically what's kicked all of this loose. Igor Witkowski was able to go in and examine the Polish war crimes trials records and find this affidavit describing the Bell. And again, people have to understand, we do not have access to that transcript. Right. But it's the details that Witkowski recounts that are the crucial thing. So you can go and look at these details and reconstruct or kind of reverse engineer what they were up to. That's the argument that I was making in my books. People have to understand that.
Right. Well, the details you've laid out about the Bell in your books, it really, gets us down that road, because we know there's missing technology from the Nazi period. And we also know that they were operating on a very advanced level. You've pointed out that they basically had cell phones and television and all kinds of things that we didn't get till much later.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Berlin Olympics was televised inside of Nazi. That's 1936.
Wow, incredible.
On television, turn on your television and there's Dolph in the box in the Olympics. That's literally what was going on. And, Nazi Germany did have broadcast type theaters with television sets in them all over Berlin. You could go watch the news.
Wow.
They were expensive equipment at the time, but you could actually go to these television theaters and watch the news. Imagine turning it on and there's Dolph, giving you the daily news. And that technology incidentally came from America. Philo Farnsworth, right, who developed television. He sold a lot of his patents to the Nazis, went over to Germany and helped them develop all of this stuff. And then during the war, the Germans were successful in miniaturizing a television camera into something about the size of a shoebox.
Wow.
Yeah. Now stop and think about that. That means they were very advanced in vacuum tubes, how to miniaturize them. I believe that they had primitive silicon chips, very primitive, but nevertheless that they were working on something very close to a semiconductor. So yeah, there's this explosion of technology inside of Nazi Germany. And I think that it's largely because they were willing to think entirely outside the box. Mm-hmm. And, Kammler, that was his specialty. That's what he set up his think tank to do. It was a DARPA.
He's another Nazi who has multiple death stories.
Oh, yeah. Just like, yeah, count them, 4 different deaths.
Wow.
Which makes me think that, again, they're putting out such obfuscated confusion. They did that with Hitler's death. They did that with Martin Bormann's death. Right. And here's and they did it with Gestapo Miller. And they did it with Hans Kammler. So in other words, the way I'm looking at it, you're looking at a huge disinformation operation to create such confusion in the narrative that these people are able to get out and escape.
Exactly.
And I think that's exactly what happened to Kammler.
And the target for where they're going, Argentina.
Well, in that new book that you referred to that came out about Kamler, they're arguing that he came to this country.
Yes.
And he may have, that's what Igor Vitkovsky thinks. That's what Nick Cook thinks. I think that he probably went to Argentina, because when you examine, and this is the problem in historiography of this period, most people are concentrating on the United States and they're forgetting all about Argentina.
Yeah.
And the Argentines are very clear. There are Argentines that Jeffrey Cook, I think is his name, talks about, that saw a Junkers 390, which is an enormous aircraft, even by today's standards, landing in Argentina. So,
yeah,
my thinking is, he was probably doing the Kamler thing. He was probably playing all sides against the middle. He may have had contact with the Americans, probably had contact with the Argentines. This was another piece of work. And, I think you can make a case for both places.
Well, it's interesting. And I'll mention the book that we're talking about by Reuter here, Dean Reuter, along with Colm Lowry and Keith Jester. It's The Hidden Nazi, is this book we're referencing. It's so interesting to me how much, as I was reading this book, I was thinking about your books, because for some reason when I was reading this, all these details started to come out, and I was like, this really is bringing me back to a couple of books that you wrote. But one of the things that's in here that I think is fascinating, since they think you came to America, is that in the case of von Braun and Dornberger, we know that they did. And what they're saying in here is that they made a deal with GE sometime around December 44 to come here, even before the war was lost.
Mm-hmm. So, and what's the company involved in the construction of the Bell? It's Germany's General Electric, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgemeinschaft. So so there's another little dot that connects all of this. So I think at least as far as America is concerned, when you're dealing with Operation Paperclip, what you're doing is you're setting up the infrastructure for a vast post-war secret projects type of research. And that's why they're so hot to get their hands on all these people and bring them to this country, or at least tie them to this country somehow.
Right. And we understand about Operation Paperclip, but there's more that we don't know anything about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The problem with Paperclip, particularly when you deal with people like Kurt Davis, what most people don't realize, and I find this more than coincidental, is that after the Roswell incident, and you look at the Magic 12 documents, and supposedly they bring in a bunch of these Nazis to look at the Roswell wreckage. Supposedly, I mean, that's what the Magic 12 documents say. And I'm inclined to think that probably happened, because who else are you going to turn to that would have any sort of expertise in advanced aerodynes? It was after that incident that Kurt Davis, one of these Nazis brought over under Paperclip, was charged again by somebody in U.S. Army counterintelligence, and they reopened his security file, the U.S. Army did, to re-vet him, because they had learned that Davis had denounced a fellow worker to the Gestapo in 1942. Now, Davis, in case people don't know who he is, Kurt Davis is one of these people that hovers between the Bell project inside of Nazi Germany and what I call the public secret weapons project, which are the rockets. Okay. Right. He's involved in both. So he's part of von Braun's team. And it's Davis that developed the test measuring equipment for von Braun at Peenemünde and the rockets. The key thing here is that Davis is not a rocket scientist. He's a plasma scientist. And he's involved intimately with the AEG company in Germany, with the Bell project. And I think because of that, going on to my speculation that the Apollo program struck some sort of deal with the Nazis to get their hands on some of that technology, to get us to the moon and back, Davis ends up as the senior flight administrator for Project Apollo at Cape Canaveral. So in other words, you have a plasma physicist.
Yeah.
Not a rocket scientist, a plasma physicist running the day-to-day operation of Project Apollo. A Nazi.
Yeah. I mean, that's cast against type if I ever heard it.
I mean, yeah, precisely.
I think it's interesting. I have a shot here just to bring that home. That's interesting to me, too, because Davis and von Braun become the public face of that launch, but Davis is the one who is out of place there.
Davis is entirely out of place.
Yeah.
And incidentally, he ends up, by the end of his career, just before he retires from NASA, he ends up in charge of NASA's UFO files.
Right.
Davis, a Nazi, in charge of this country's, NASA agency UFO files. And then when he finally retires for NASA, guess where you find him? You find him on the board of OTROG.
OTROG, yeah.
Uh-huh.
OTRAG.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Orbital Transport Raketenaktionsgesellschaft is what it stands for in German. OTROG.
And where were these guys?
Well, listen, we wouldn't really know a thing about OTROG unless, big thank you to Mikhail Gorbachev.
Right.
Because Gorbachev is the one, just, as the Soviet Union's in its death throes, that made this whole Gorbachev brought it out. He's the guy that brought everybody's attention that, hey, by the way, did you know that West Germany has its own Area 51 in the Congo?
This is the thing.
And they're up to all sorts of nasty stuff, including viruses, biological warfare, cruise missiles. Right. And he just lays it all out there. And
I found a picture of one of the. What are they launching?
What is that? It doesn't look. It doesn't look like any sort of rocket I've ever seen.
It looks like an Egyptian monument or something.
Yeah. It looks like an. Yeah.
If you look at the top here, actually, it's interesting because they have the OTRAG right on the top there. Mm-hmm. Who's involved in OTROG?
Okay, OTROG was a private company set up in West Germany in the 80s. To develop cheap, reusable, note the word, reusable, and where's Elon Musk from? Reusable rocket technology to launch satellites cheaply.
Right.
Okay, that's the public story. And Gorbachev comes along and blows the lid off of all of it because what he's saying is that OTROG was the way that the United States was transferring advanced technologies secretly to West Germany, cruise missile technology, and then we get the biowarfare. Who knows where that's coming from?
Yeah.
But there was this preserve inside of the Congo of about 250,000, I believe I've seen one report, square miles. This is huge, inside of the Congo, which was OTROG's private preserve. It was the West German Area 51. And, this is typical German behavior. If they want to get their hands on a technology or experiment or do research in a technology that by treaty they are prohibited from doing on German soil.
Right.
So, the Germans,
Africa.
They ship it all to Africa or just across the border into Holland,
Right, yeah.
This is the way they've gotten around it. They've been up to this stuff since the ink was drying on the Treaty of Versailles. Right. We'll ship out all of our secret research to the Soviet Union or wherever, and we'll do it that way. Right. So, it's typical. It's typical of the German pattern of dealing with treaty obligations. They just ship it overseas and they privatize it. So OTROG, as far as I know, was in existence from about 1983 up until 90, 91, sometime in there. And then it was officially shut down. I have my suspicions. Like I say, where's Elon Musk getting all of his technology from?
Right.
How did that just start up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he is German.
You're right.
So I hate to point that out. I'm not trying to pick on the Germans here, but it's just another little factoid to factor in.
No, you're telling it like it is. Well, this is interesting because we don't really understand the roots of SpaceX.
No, we really don't.
We really don't. And
I think you're looking at OTROG 2.0.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And the mystery around this company, it's so very interesting to me when you look at it, because you can get away with a lot in Africa.
Right.
There's not a lot of oversight. I mean, there's probably more oversight in the desert in Nevada than there is in the middle of the Congo in Africa.
Yep.
So if you're going to test out, if you've kept Bell type technology, that's a pretty good place to test it.
Oh, yeah. You could do it in Africa. You can do it in the boonies of Argentina. There's all sorts of places you could do it. I've tried to get people to understand that this Nazi International thing that I've been talking about is not a bunch of swastika armband wearing guys goose stepping around and celebrating Hitler's birthday. These are the Martin Bormanns. These are the guys in the business suits, but they're still every bit as fascist as they ever were. And to Bormann's quote unquote credit, I think that what he did setting this whole thing up is he just simply took all of that kooky Nazi racial ideology and just threw it right out and said, we're going to get down to business here.
Right.
And that's what I think you're looking at. So you're looking at a kind of a global consortium with little public fronts popping up here and there that have like Elon Musk, have suspicious unanswered questions.
Yeah.
How did this all of a sudden come out of nowhere? Where did the technology come from? Who was involved? And what are the ties of those involved? What are their histories? Who are they connected with? No one's talking about it. And, I haven't found any information on it. It's like a black box.
Yeah. And he makes a lot of very unusual comments, like Mars. There's a big Mars fascination around what they're doing.
Oh, yeah.
This is very interesting to me. Also, when I look at this and I think about all the things that are coming out around the UFO file on, just going through the mainstream media, and they're saying, well, it's not necessarily alien, but we don't think it's Russia or China. Well, what's left?
Well, not much. Is it the French? And listen, I'm not ruling France out, because in prior to our public launch, we were talking about Thomas Townsend Brown.
Yes.
The famous American physicist who was all about electrogravity. Okay, right. That was his bag. Well, in I think 1952 or 3, somewhere around there, as he's already established a reputation for investigating electrogravitic lift and propulsion. France invited, because he was getting nowhere with the United States, France invited him over to France. And he went. This is what most people don't know about him. He actually went to France, and France created a vacuum chamber for him to do his experiments in, to establish whether or not it was simply an ion wind that was creating the lift, as many people were claiming. So he performed his experiments in France for the French government and successfully demonstrated that his lift would still work in vacuum. And then at that point, President de Gaulle said, "Thank you very much. Back to the States you go."
They got some kind of confirmation.
Yeah, they got the confirmation. So there's another country you can put on your list for probably having more up its sleeve than it's letting people know. Okay.
This is so fascinating, because I had no idea about any of that. But today I've been reading all about the French Space Force. And Macron setting up this woman to run just that. I have the article here. I was going to read it for you. This is interesting to me, because French having a space force seems a little odd. You'd think they would be back in the pack a little bit.
No.
Yeah.
No. The European launch vehicle is largely a French design.
Okay.
with some German involvement, obviously, but it's largely a French design. So, in other words, the European Space Agency is running its public program with French technology. And all of those launches are carried out where? In French Guiana.
Mm-hmm.
So, France, like it or not, as a player, they're just, they're being typically French about it and not talking very much about it.
Right.
So, the fact that you, and I even talk about other French secret weapons research in my very first book, Giza Death Star, believe it or not, because they were investigating, just like the Nazis, they were investigating any avenue to create a weapons technology that was not nuclear, but was of sufficient strategic value that they would be able to create a deterrent to the Warsaw Pact. They were investigating infrasound, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and actually had created some infrasonic weapons in the 1950s, both portable and really big stuff. A French scientist by the name of Gavreau led that development. And this is right at the time, incidentally, that de Gaulle is starting, the French nuclear program and inviting Thomas Townsend Brown to come over and run his experiments in a vacuum chamber. So, the French are up to their earlobes in this stuff. They just don't talk about it.
Wow, incredible. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. You're on X Series 93 here. This is the Deep State Space Wars that we're talking about with Dr. Joseph Farrell. We're going to be taking questions in the second half of the program, so ask them and ask them all in caps. Miss Olivia is putting those together. How's it going out there?
Great questions already.
Yeah, fantastic. You got one?
Well,
you want to say it?
I'll say it right now.
Excellent. I have so many things to go through. So
Actually, I want to throw this one out. Ed Kaufman said the initials GE were on the craft of George Adamski's famous flying saucer.
Oh, really?
I thought it was fascinating.
Well, we know Adamski was. This is very interesting because they allowed him into all kinds of defense installations.
Mm-hmm.
And he came up with the whole, Venusian stories landing in the California desert. And they mixed it with a lot of kind of theosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this kind of theosophical, we're here to help you thing. And they look very Pleiadian, the aliens that he meets. But he does seem to have, at that time, an awful lot of footage of something back there. And then later, he's denounced as a fraud and all the rest. But he actually was laid to rest on military grounds. So we have somebody who's kind of a big player in there. Yeah,
I've been eternally suspicious of his connections with the U.S. military and the stories that he was putting out.
Yes.
The interesting thing about Adamski, and I talk about him in Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops. I devote a whole chapter to.
That's a great book.
It's an overlooked book, unfortunately, but it's an important book. But
it's a foundational book, really.
It's a foundational book,
yeah.
because you look at the message that Adamski is putting out, and it's like reading the book of Exodus with extraterrestrials. I have to go over the hill. You guys stay here, and I'm going to talk with my Venusian. That's Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
So he's got this message. He's got this revelation that he's been entrusted to. So that looks to me like classic psyops. Exactly the sort of thing that if you were in the national security establishment and suspecting that you might be facing, a Tower of Babel moment, well, you're going to go back and you're going to examine ancient texts and so on from that point of view. So I view that as a bit of narrative prep, even as early as Adamski.
Wow. That's fascinating because I think Adamski, his story had the most impact in that period.
Oh, yeah.
There's a few other people like him.
George Van Tassel and people like that.
Yeah. He created the Integratron, and he seemed totally legitimate. And he had worked with Howard Hughes. So he had the background. These people are getting flown around in these advanced craft, and they're getting told, oh, we're looking in on you. We don't want you to have a nuclear war. That's the message. But it's interesting when you look at it with Adamski, because that story really becomes this core thing. It's almost like that's what built the early UFO story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. there, in my opinion, there wouldn't be a ufology community really without Adamski, because if you look at his career, he had access to the radio talk shows of the day. Think of Long John Nabel and people like this,
Right.
or Paris Flamand. All of these people that were on the radio, in the media, and willing to talk about the subject of UFOs. And he was one of the few people that had that kind of access. So the message was getting put out there. And again, I think the message was largely one of narrative preparation. So I'm not surprised that he had those military connections. I'm not surprised at all. And I think you could even argue a case that maybe he was a front for a narrative that the military wanted to put out. But it's interesting that you mentioned that part of his narrative, and you're right, was the threat of nuclear warfare.
Yes.
Because what do you see in so much UFO activity? Well, they hover literally around nuclear sites constantly in this country, in the Soviet Union. Anybody who's got a nuclear pop gun, these things show up and do monitoring activity and do fun things like turn on and off flights of ICBMs and reprogram the targeting inside them, and all sorts of fun stuff. So yeah,
I mean, it's incredible when you think about it, because they have the ability. We've seen that in the case of like Bentwaters was another one of these nuclear bases where they showed up. I recently did a documentary called UFO Assassins, and that has in it the story of the Pascagoula aliens. And it goes into how Litton Industries was operating a huge nuclear facility right there. Mm-hmm. And even after those guys got abducted, 3 weeks later, there's a huge underwater UFO story that happens right there.
Yep.
So there they are again, checking out the nuclear facilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, this brings us back to Thomas Townsend Brown, because when Brown returned from France, he published a research project proposal that he submitted to the U.S. government called Project Winter Haven. You can actually go online and look this thing up. And one of the project proposals, or an aspect of what he was proposing with his electrogravity experiments, was he was proposing something that I find very interesting. I mean, he's anticipating Colonel Bearden, Tom Bearden, by 3 decades. Because what he was proposing was, okay, we've got these things, they're showing up in our skies. And how did they know to show up at this time? Mm-hmm. And he speculated, he kind of implies that when nuclear weapons were being tested, that and I hope people latch on to what I say, because this is very significant that Brown was on to this. He was kind of implying that a nuclear detonation sets off longitudinal waves in the medium of space-time. And that would make them, by most people's thinking, superluminal. In other words, faster than the speed of light. So that if you had a means of detecting these waves, you would be able to pinpoint who out there is letting off nuclear firecrackers. That was his first proposal. And then his second one was very interesting. He said, if we can find a way to control, and I'm paraphrasing him here, a way to control these longitudinal waves in the fabric of space-time, gravity waves is essentially what he was talking about, we could have a means of communication that would be both secret, because no one would think of longitudinal waves in the medium as a means of communication. It would be both secret and practically instantaneous. And then something interesting happens. Officially, his project is rejected by the government. So then where do you find him? Well, you find him off the coast of California for a brief period on Catalina Island, doing tests of rocks. And then after that, He shows up at, guess where? Lockheed Martin on their staff. Doing what? We don't know.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
So he's moving right through the Black Project.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and he has access to something. There's a story that his daughter tells in a book that she was putting out about him. And she tells that they demonstrated this very interesting device he created. We don't get to know everything that it does, but it seems to have some control over space-time. But he calls it the audio fan, which doesn't sound, it seems like, it's audio and it's a fan. What's the big deal? And yet some very unusual things happen in relation to it. After he demonstrates it, it disappears. But a weird thing happens, which is it shows up on kind of home shopping networks as what we were talking about. Was,
a little cube.
Yeah.
That little cube that's supposedly able to air condition a room.
Yeah.
I think that's, what I think? I think that's straight out of his audio fan.
Yeah.
I think it's straight out of that. Yeah.
Whatever it was about that technology that he demonstrated, they took it out immediately.
Oh, yeah.
It was lost to history, but they saved that little salvageable piece for marketing purposes.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I think they're letting little things out, just as kind of beta tests to see if, number one, if there's a market, and number two, if they can control it, and number three, if they notice anybody's going to start connecting dots.
Right.
Yeah.
Is Thomas Townsend Brown a good candidate for a scientist who learned how to rework what we had found in relation to alien tech?
Let me put it this way. And you know me, I'm skeptical on the whole crash and retrieval narrative because we've had so many crashes and retrievals. Like I say, pretty soon we're going to have to start crashing our stuff on ET's homeworld so they can catch back up with us. I'm skeptical of it, but if there were anyone who I would want on a team examining some of that stuff, regardless of where it comes from, it would be him. Absolutely, it would be him. And I'll tell you something, one reason why. Brown, as you know, came out with a patent for a jet engine that would use ionized exhaust from a jet. The negative ions would be propelled out the back of the jet, and then he talked about putting positive charge on the leading edge of the lift frame of an aircraft. So in other words, what he's doing is he's increasing lift electromagnetically with this jet propulsion idea. Well, interestingly enough, the Germans came up with a very similar idea during the Second World War. You have to dig and scratch around for it before you find it, but it's there. And I don't think that the two are in communication with each other. I just think this is the sort of stuff that you think of if you're trying to think of really cool ways to get from here to there. Well, that's kind of an intermediate step. So he would be, if the Germans are doing things with the Bell, if they're doing things with ram jets, there's a good case to be made that the Germans broke the sound barrier during World War II, not Chuck Yeager a few years after it. And again, the guy involved with that was Walter Lippisch. Where does he end up? Dayton, Ohio at Wright-Patterson. Okay.
Wow.
So
well,
yeah. So, yeah, if you have something Nazi crashing in the desert in New Mexico, as I think probably happened, and it's got a bunch of weird stuff that looks partly familiar and partly unfamiliar, who do you bring in to look at it? Well, Thomas Townsend Brown is right at the top of my list.
Right.
He's definitely one I'd want to bring in to have a look at that stuff. Absolutely.
This is so interesting because there's a whole period there where we got all kinds of different crafts in the sky in the 50s and 60s. There's a whole kind of like the culture is becoming aware of it. And you have tons of pictures and all the rest of it. And in the 70s and 80s, it's expanded. It seems like the type is different and we're getting the next level of the story. What's interesting to me is now they want to publicly say all that stuff is a threat over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, they used to say, whatever it is, it's not a national security threat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it sort of let them off the hook for what they needed to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a change in tone.
Well, there's a change in the public tone.
Yeah.
I don't think that back in the post-war period, through the 50s, early 60s, when you've got all of this UFO activity going on, that privately they could have come to any other conclusion other than that this is a potential national security threat. Why? Well, one of the things I try and detail in the first Covert Wars book series was that you had numerous UFO reports at the time that were solid reports, commercial airline pilots, military pilots, and so on, where UFOs were diving at civilian airliners and so on, and forcing them to take emergency action and, dive the plane or whatever. And this happens repeatedly. So in other words, that cannot be interpreted by the national security establishment in any other way than as a national security threat. If you're able to enter airspace with impunity and demonstrate a capability to interdict that airspace with impunity, and then you have the famous Washington, D.C. 1952 UFO flag.
Right.
That's clearly a national security issue because they're buzzing the White House, and waking President Truman up, So, and we know what Truman's response was: shoot him down.
Yeah, right.
So much for the public. They're not a threat narrative,
right, yeah.
because Harry pretty much settled that one.
He was ready to go.
Yeah, he was ready to go. So yeah, I think that the public narrative has changed, and why is the question.
Fascinating. Eisenhower moves into the White House after Truman.
Mm-hmm.
He's there a solid 8 years, sets up an entire national security strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Through the war and everything else, he's obviously aware of these things. Just because they're seeing them. There's a bodyguard who comes forward years later who was there during his meeting with Churchill. Mm-hmm. He talks about how both of them, this story came out only in the last 5 years or so. He talks about how both of them discussed what to do about UFOs and how to handle that and, how to share information on it and all the rest. Mm-hmm. So Eisenhower is kind of at a different level on the UFO thing than Truman coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he is. And let's not forget that Eisenhower, when he's head of SHAEF during World War II, he has a team of military intelligence people gathering reports, on Foo Fighters and things like this. And guess who the man is that he has in charge of that?
Who?
General Trudeau.
Oh, right.
And where's Trudeau in July of 1947? In New Mexico. Yeah, and he's head of the Air Technical Intelligence Command at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
So, yeah, Eisenhower knew a lot.
No question. He's getting fed that information direct.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Trudeau sponsors Corso later in life.
Yes.
And Corso's a strange, unusual case at the end of his life.
Yeah.
He lets out something important.
Well, yeah, that Roswell book of his, I read that the first time I read it. I've read it a few times, but the first time I read it, I was just utterly mystified.
Yeah.
Because Corso is clearly pushing the ET narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. But in the very same breath, oftentimes right in the same sentence, after going on about ET, he then says something to the effect of, and this looks an awful lot like the technology we saw the Nazis involved with. Okay. What are you saying, Colonel? Are you saying that they got it from ET, or you're saying it's really Nazi and ET is a clever story to disguise? Who knows? The guy is back and forth constantly throughout that book. And I do think that he was intentionally revealing secrets. But the question is, he revealed it in such a way that the narrative he's putting forward is so badly obfuscated that you're left in an ambiguous position of what he's really trying to say.
Yes.
For my, my 2 cents worth, I think what he was really trying to do was point the finger at all of this Nazi tech. But, other people read his book and come away with an entirely different opinion, and it's easy to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. It's in that package.
It's in that package, right?
No question about it. It is a breakthrough.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Of a kind. And I do feel like there's something powerful in the way he came out. And I think he was kind of roughed up in a lot of ways, both in the mainstream and in alternative. He was sort of sidelined, and his story was, because it was just too good to be true in a sense. Because here was the man who was coordinating so much of that. I liked one of the things he said. He said that they moved the UFO technology through the Foreign Technology Office.
Right.
That's interesting to me, because I always look and find out, I'm trying to see how they move it through the various government agencies. That's a good target.
Well, it's a good target, especially if you're coming out with a narrative that is it ET or is it Nazi?
Right.
Take your pick.
Yeah.
Because you can take all that Nazi tech and move it through the Foreign Tech Office.
Right.
And his other thing that he says that I find is an aspect of his story that to me rings absolutely true. Because he says that what they did was that through that office, they were salting this technology into various American corporations for development. So in other words, they were privatizing it.
Right.
And that's a perfect way to keep things absolutely secret. Because if it's corporate proprietary information, not even the government really knows exactly what they're all up to. So in other words, Corso is kind of telling us the same thing that you encounter in some of the Magic 12 documents, where they indicate that Nixon took the decision to turn all of this over to the defense corporations.
Right.
And essentially privatize the whole UFO file. And I have no difficulty thinking that that's the case, because once it's in the hands of a Raytheon or a Lockheed Martin and they're getting all of this money, they'll do anything they want with it.
No question. No question. And there's no trail anymore.
And there's no trail.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's no trail.
And now these very same people coming out through Lockheed and the CIA, they want to be the ones who come back out and say, we're going to brief Congress on a UFO threat.
Yeah, exactly.
Which means they can make it anything they want. I mean,
yeah,
that's
exactly. Yeah, if it's proprietary, they get to create the narrative.
There's no breadcrumb trail.
There's no breadcrumb trail. Yeah, exactly.
You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here. This is X Series 93. We're going to be taking your questions shortly. We're getting deep into the UFO file here. This is Deep State Space Wars, and we've been seeing a lot of that. We haven't talked about the Space Force so much, Joseph.
Right.
This is a crucial piece.
It is.
Trump and the Space Force, he's announced the 6th branch as of December of last year of the military, and the Space Force is real now. Other countries will follow suit and all the rest. Space is a warfighting domain, opens it up to a lot of different things. But it also cuts him in on a piece of the pie of what he knows is going on in relation to the UFO file and space. And that's where you see the weirdness with him coming out and talking to his son and reflecting that knowledge. What is the Space Force about?
Well, the way I look at it, Daniel, it's a public disclosure of something that's probably been there for a long time.
Yeah.
I go back to Gary McKinnon and his hack of the Department of Defense and what he claimed he saw, which was he saw a list of ships in a space fleet with captains and crew names. Okay. Now, that sounds like a ridiculous story, except for Ronald Reagan.
Uh-huh.
Because if you read Reagan's memoirs, there's a little passage in them that he was shocked to find. And how this got through the censors, I don't know, unless they wanted it to get out, you know. So take your pick. Is this real? Is it Memorex? Is it disinformation? But nevertheless, Reagan in his memoir says that when he was briefed on American space capability, and this is the 1980s, okay, he was told that we had a space deployment capability of about 300 personnel. Now, stop and think what he just told you. He just told you that you can take all of our space shuttle fleet at the time, including the space shuttles that hadn't even been built yet, and it does not total to 300 people.
Right.
It totals to a fraction of that.
Oh, yeah. We've only had 12 men walk on the moon.
Yeah, exactly. So, in other words, Reagan, if you take him at his word, and I tend to do so, he's just told you that there's a space capability vastly over what the public knows about. So, I'm thinking there's your Space Force.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing about Trump is, if you recall, he made that speech after we had, I forget the general's name, it may have been Milley, I don't remember, at the Air Force Academy, where he says, you know, you're going to have to be prepared to fight little green men. And that was the phrase he used. Okay. And of course, there was an internet storm over his remarks, and the naysayers were out in force saying, well, that's just Army code for how we refer to Russians in their camouflage gear. That was the explanation. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Wait a minute. A general, 3 or 4 star general, is not going to be so careless with words as to use a code in a public speech that means one thing to the military and is going to be taken another way by the public.
Right.
He knows exactly what he's saying. And he's saying something that is ambiguous in the way it can be interpreted, and he's doing so deliberately. This is a general. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So I think that was a little clue. So anyway, that we had that speech, and Trump goes out to California and gives his speech, and he says it's high time that we have another Space Force. And I'm thinking, whoa, Don, another? You mean we already have one that we don't know about? And now we need
closing the first one.
Yeah, and now we need another one. So, you know, the way I look at it is that you have a typical pattern here, and you see it in Nazi Germany. You know, Hitler, and I mentioned this in the books, Hitler in 1944 decides with a formal declaration that they're going to go ahead and produce V-2 rockets, okay? Now, what he's telling you is we've been developing these things for the last 10 years. That anybody that does the research knows that. So what is Hitler really saying? He's saying that they have come to the point now where they're ready for operational deployment. That's what he's saying.
Right.
So the pattern has always been that you make something public after you get the technology developed to deploy something operationally. That's what's going on. Yeah. So when Trump says, oh, we need another Space Force, what I think he's saying is we've got the technology developed sufficiently now that we can go ahead and just admit the fact and make it public. That's what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you look at what the Space Force has put out since that announcement, it's putting out all sorts of fluff about command and control procedures and training and so on and so forth.
Yes.
You know, and I'm thinking, oh, come on, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
You're saying this explains the missing 21 trillion? I'm sorry, no. It doesn't take $21 trillion to make a PowerPoint presentation. So, yeah, so you know, it's more fun and games, but yeah, that's what I think happened there.
Well, it's fascinating. There's a story that came out on the Space Force. This is from yesterday, Space Force on alert behind Russia's mysterious testing of deadly anti-satellite weapons in orbit. They already have the Space Force in a tactical fighting position, and it's already we're going to get our Gulf of Tonkin incident in space, right? So what they have here is last week the head of the U.S. newest military branch, the Space Force, cautioned publicly for the first time that Moscow had undertaken at least 2 concerning anti-satellite weapons tests in recent months in a potential bid to develop an orbit efficiency that could dangerously hinder the U.S.'s heavy dependence on space-based systems. Are they setting up, their own kind of false flag there?
I think they could be.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, the idea that Russia and China don't want weaponized space systems, it's not because they're not developing them themselves. They clearly have been.
Yeah.
It's a way to stop the U.S. economic preponderance from achieving a superiority in that platform. That's all it is.
All right.
And in the meantime, they're going to continue to develop their own. So could they be setting it up for some sort of false flag incident? Sure. And, just as an aside here, if you've got that floating around, do you really want to move to digital currency and have everything in the cloud?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. I mean,
they're driving over a cliff with that.
Yeah, it's suicidal, quite frankly. And this is the problem with these people. They've got to get their narrative, to at least make some sort of consistent rather than contradictory sense. But Russia doing this, along with at the same time developing their own independent internal clearing capability, jumping on board with the Japanese, that's a story that people forget, for some international clearing. That to me is telling me that they are developing a very hard and redundant space interdiction capability. And let's remember the other aspect of this, Daniel. The Chinese and the Russians both have successfully tested ground to space anti-satellite systems. So, they may have an advantage on us in some of those areas, but the fact of the matter is space is going to be weaponized. You can have all the best intentions in the world, but the fact of the matter is pure geopolitics is going to necessitate it. And anybody with any sort of space capability from Europe to India to Japan, China, they're going to do this, like it or not, because they have to.
Right.
They have to.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the roots of the space program were all about making sure it was all about research and science. And Kennedy's saying when we go out there, there's not going to be any war out there. And we signed on to treaties about that. But over time, there's just, everybody's getting into that military footing.
Yeah, it's easy to say when you're one of 2 spacefaring powers on the surface of the planet.
Right.
It's a lot more difficult when you throw in India and China and Japan and Brazil and Europe. Everybody's going to be doing this. And again, I suspect that you could have some sort of false flag incident. The real question is, what's the narrative going to be that accompanies it?
Right.
Let's remember something very significant. A month before the Chelyabinsk meteor incident, then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev in Russia went on Russian television and said, well, we need to develop an asteroid defense capability, and we need, to do this in concert with our international partners. But, he went on to say, if no one's willing to go along with us and do this, we're just going to have to do it ourselves. So there you have it. So even that narrative of some sort of extraterrestrial threat, this time from asteroids, is there. Well, we know Carol Rosen's affidavit. We're in the asteroid stage, and the final one is ET. Yeah. So, they're prepping these narratives all over the place. And
No
the other thing is, I don't know if you've been watching, but during this whole coronavirus fracas that's been going on, there have been these articles from NASA on phys.org and so on and so forth. Oh, this asteroid is going to be passing real close to the planet Earth. These asteroid stories keep coming out.
Yeah. I mean, it's first of all, it's the land of the fireballs.
Yep.
Everywhere you turn now, there's a fireball video or story. And now these other ones they're going real close, like, hey, that thing was as big as a moon, but don't worry about it. It went by. Even though since when? Yeah.
Well, here's the problem. How are you going, if you're having these big rocks flying by, how are you going to destroy them?
Yeah.
What they're really saying is we need to put some pretty powerful weapons up there,
right, to
get rid of these dang things, or at least nudge them aside.
Yeah.
Well, as far as Dmitry admitted, he was actually asked during that interview by some Russian reporter in the audience, well, how are we going to, defend against asteroids? And his comment was, oh, we've got our thermonuclear missiles. We can blow them out of the sky, nudge them aside with a hydrogen bomb. And then he went on to say something that I thought was really interesting. And we have other ways too. Oh, you do? What might those be, Dmitry?
Right. What'd you have in mind?
Yeah, what'd you have in mind there? Exactly.
Wow.
And then we get President Trump a few weeks ago on one of his tweets, which are entertaining if nothing else, saying, well, yeah, we've got atomic weapons, we've got nuclear weapons, but we don't need those.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, we don't. Well, what else do we have?
Well, so bring me back to the Reagan-Gorbachev conversation. No one's ever explained this either. There's two weird conversations that they have. The first one,
that's being kind.
The first one is they come out of a press conference, out of a meeting, and they say, we're talking about zero, bringing the nuclear weapons down to zero.
Nothing.
I mean, how do you do that exactly?
Well, how do you do that?
All right, that's 1987. Okay.
Yeah.
Nuclear weapons, we got them in 45. That's 42 years later. You're just going to go to zero?
Yeah.
It's really a strange thing that they did.
It's very strange, but the first thing it tells me is that, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are, number one, not stupid people, and number two, they're geopolitical realists.
Yeah.
I mean, Gorbachev especially. And for either one of them to have talked seriously about that to me is an admission that they've got much more sophisticated stuff capable of wreaking strategic level destruction on a nuclear scale without all the nasty stuff that goes with nuclear weapons like fallout and things like that.
Right.
So and it's clear from what both the Soviet Union and the United States have been publishing in their literature about defense systems. They were both talking about kinetic weapons. The Russian anti-satellite killers are thought to be purely kinetic weapons, which are not that difficult to come up with. The United States has been talking about, tungsten rods of God since Reagan's Star Wars program. And, that would be nuclear scale destruction without the fallout.
Wow.
So there's no doubt in my mind that again, the development of the actual system precedes any public discussion of it. It's the pattern all over again.
Wow. It's incredible because that means that they were already outdated.
Yeah.
Nuclear,
yeah,
ICBMs and all the rest in 87.
Yeah.
And, here we are 30 years later.
Yeah.
So they've gone way beyond it, but we still talk about, hey, let's update our nuclear programs.
Yeah. And again, Daniel, I'm suspicious of that narrative because given the way that at least the government in this country operates, particularly now with FASB 56 budgeting regulations in effect, you could take any amount of money and say, oh, we're going to build X number of hydrogen bombs with this and really sock it to the Chinese if they ever, give us any problems. You can take all that money and put it into Rod of God satellites, probably for a lot less money than the equivalent number of hydrogen bombs. And you're going to reap a much securer and more operable weapon system than a hydrogen bomb. Because again, a hydrogen bomb, you're going to have fallout, like it or not. A Rod of God, no. You can take out that chemical plant in Chongqing, China, and leave a big crater in the ground, which is suspiciously deep, I might add.
Right.
and not have any of that nasty fallout as residue. So do I think these countries have that sort of stuff? Yes. Am I suspicious of what they might be telling us publicly that the money's going for as opposed to what it's really going for? Yes. Absolutely I am.
Wow.
It's like you say, why do you need a hydrogen bomb?
Yeah.
That's a monstrously difficult piece of equipment to engineer.
Right.
A Rod of God, comparatively, is not near as difficult to engineer. It's expensive, but it's not as difficult.
Right.
So would they, just from the standpoint of efficiency of spending per dollar or ruble, yeah, they would.
This is incredible. The 0 point option back then, and the Rod of God thing sounds like that fire from the sky. I mean, it's kind of where they're going. It fits more with their global control grid in a way, because they're going to be operating everything from space.
Yeah, and coincidentally, a Rod of God would be the perfect sort of kinetic weapon to do what? Take out an asteroid or a saucer.
Right.
Because it is a kinetic weapon. So yeah, you have a system there that, to my thinking, would be an operational system that could do double duty. Whereas, pointing and aiming an ICBM at an asteroid is a little bit more difficult, and it's a lot slower.
Right. Yeah, right. Joseph, in this book, this is a fantastic book you did, Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations. This book, because of all the announcements that have been going on, etc., somehow this book seems more timely, as if you were looking in a crystal ball at the time. But what's fascinating about this book is you talk about Bissell in this period, the JFK period, and they're developing satellites, and they're capable of doing double duty, but it's a very interesting thing they're set up for.
Which is, give me a reminder of what you're getting at.
They're looking simultaneously at the Soviet Union, but then out into space.
Yes. Okay.
So
yes.
Yeah.
I think there's an aspect to the spy satellite story that clearly implicates that they were trying to create a platform that could do double reconnaissance duty.
Right.
Because those satellites were designed, especially the early ones, to have two camera systems, one for the broad picture to find out what they needed to zero in on, and then the more precisely focused satellite cameras. So I'm thinking, okay, that would be the perfect thing if you were trying to look at a region of space and monitor activity, if any, there, and then if you saw anything, you could zero in on it.
Right.
So in other words, I'm assuming, and this is something that did not occur in any of the spy satellite literature that I read, but I'm assuming that meant that those satellites had some maneuver capability in orbit in order to change direction of what they wanted to target. And I was not able to find any confirmation of that, but it stands to reason that they're not going to stick a satellite up there that doesn't have some sort of maneuvering capability. Because that limits drastically the amount of intelligence that you have. So I'm thinking, yes, given the context that Richard Bissell is involved in so many of these covert technology programs, you know, the U-2 and all of that stuff, the spy satellites. He's even involved in the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
So, I mean, this is a guy that had his hand in every aspect of the pie. And there's something else very significant about the development of spy satellites, because Alan Dulles, who put Bissell in charge of that program, decided that he would fund it from the CIA, get this, from the CIA's unvouchered funds.
Oh, there's your black budget.
Bingo. Ding, ding, ding.
Unvouchered. That's nice.
Yeah, isn't that convenient? So, you know, we don't know how much money they poured into it, is what he's telling you.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you take my hypothesis that there's a hidden system of finance with vast amounts of cash and vast amounts of rehypothecation capability, the sky's the limit.
Right. Which means they were already observing these things close up in 1961.
Oh, easy.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. That's exactly what I'm thinking. It's interesting to me that no one has yet tried to confirm the hypothesis by doing FOIA requests of any spy satellite images of UFOs.
Oh, right. Yeah. Hoping that they're not exempt.
Hoping that they're not exempt. Right?
Yeah. This is interesting to me because it seems to me that they have this interrupted period, and it's absurd by any normal standard, where you go from 1972 to the present, and there's no manned visits to the moon. Yeah. It's absurd. Right?
It's absurd.
Almost 50 years, and then you're talking about it like it's going to be a great thing again.
Yeah.
So for me, when I look at that, I say they realized, well, a few things may have happened, but one of the key points, I think, is, you know, if they found anything like ruins or whatever up there, you can't have this going on repeatedly because people are going to want to see more of it. And so you need a whole program to kind of like get rid of
black.
Yes. What do you think of that?
I think it's eminently possible. And I'll tell you why. Again, the Russians are the fly in the ointment because during the Soviet space program era in the Cold War, they were publishing all sorts of wild stuff by Western standards in magazines like Sputnik and so on and so forth. And one of the things that they published was, I think it was in Sputnik, was an article about how the moon is nothing but a big spaceship. And they were serious about it. You know, and they listed all the reasons that we know all too well. What is that big thing doing there? And how, in the name of sense, by any physics that we understand, did it get there to do what it's doing by the capture model?
Right.
It can't be done.
Yeah, right.
Cannot be done. You know, I go back to Isaac Newton. The moon is the only thing that gives me a headache. You know, that's what he said. You know, Isaac Asimov pointed the same thing out. So what is that up there? It's the biggest UFO, and we all see it every day that it's visible, and we don't think anything about it. But when you stop and think about the physics of what's involved in doing what it's doing, it was parked there.
Right. Yeah.
So the Soviets come out with all this stuff, and then the Soviets are the ones that discover what on the surface of the moon? The Blair cuspids. You know about those? The Blair cuspids are these little obelisk-like things sticking up from the surface of the moon in a nice little geometrical pattern that's clearly artificial. And they come right out and say, this is clearly artificial. So the Soviets have been the ones, you know, that are the constant fly in the ointment for the NASA narrative. No, it's just a big ball of rock.
Right.
So, but it rings. But anyway, no, I think it's entirely possible that they saw stuff up there. I mean, just read Richard Hoagland's Dark Mission if you're not convinced about that. They clearly did see something up there, and they decided to take it all black for whatever reason. Now, I don't think the reason was because it would be too upsetting to religious people that, there's evidence of ET out there. I'm fairly religious and it never bothered me.
Yeah, right.
quite frankly. And
you write about it all the time.
I write about it all the time. It's a big deal. So, I don't think that's the reason they give, but I think the real reason is, okay, if there's stuff out there that's artificial, somebody was there and had some pretty sophisticated technology to be there and park things like the moon.
Right. And that blows away your whole primitive background.
Oh yeah.
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 So that introduces you to there's somebody out there who's more advanced,
right?
Or there was a culture here that was more advanced. Whatever it is, your narrative, your human narrative, is pretty blown away.
Yeah, the whole history of the history of humanity, as told by Quackademia, is just thrown right out, thrown right out the window. And I think the real reason that they keep it secret is not even that. It's because they want to know how the technology worked.
Right.
Because if you can reduplicate or reverse engineer that technology, then you've got a leg up over everybody else on planet Earth. That's the space race.
Yes.
And we're in it right now.
Let's get real about that.
Yeah, let's get to Mars in a hurry. Because there's a lot of stuff up there.
Absolutely. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 93. We're here with Dr. Joseph Farrell, GizaDeathStar.com. Dr. Farrell's new book is The Tower of Babel Moment. You just did the second book on the McCarthy hearings, and that is absolutely fascinating because we get so much early UFO information in that as well. I highly recommend those books. We're going to be taking your questions in a couple minutes here. How are you doing out there?
Good. Can we go into Mars right now?
What do you
Mars?
Everybody has their theory. Are we there already? Who's there? What's there?
All right, you got a real question?
That's the question.
Well, we'll go through them one at a time. So,
well, let's just do the meta-analysis of it.
Yeah, okay, Mars.
Mars?
This is interesting, Joseph, because in really the whole setup to the development of science fiction, if you go back 19th century, it's really the moon and Mars.
Yes.
People really like H.G. Wells, Martians, this whole thing, 50s sci-fi. What is it about Mars?
Well, number one, Mars in esoteric lore is the planet or god of war, and that implies a civilization and a technology. And I think that it's so present in our psyche, and I'll be quite honest and go so far as to say I believe that its presence in our psyche all over the world is because we have some sort of perhaps genetic memory of catastrophic events in our solar system history that involve that planet. I make no bones about it in my book, The Cosmic War, that I think Mars was involved.
Right.
In some capacity. Add to that the Viking satellite photos of the face and the whole controversy that touched off that's still going on about the Cydonia region on Mars. Now, I'll be honest again and say that when I look at those photos, even the more recent photos that supposedly disprove the face that's nothing but, a mound, I'm looking at it exactly the same way that Hoagland is looking at it and seeing a very decayed object, an artificial object.
Right.
And there are too many other oddities that are not even on Cydonia about Mars. There are clear indications of pyramidal structures that I can't see any geological explanation for that pepper the surface of the planet. There are just too many odd pictures that you can go online and look at from NASA's own photos and see all of this stuff that look like parts to automobile engines and, fossilized somethings, and
Yeah, right.
you know,
And we know that they make a habit of removing those things from the pictures over time.
oh yeah, they do. They put them up, and then people start saying, "Oh, you know, look at there," and then they go back and airbrush this stuff out. So yeah, there's clearly something there. So the question is, are we there? Well, if you have, let's go back to the Bell story. If you give it any credence, and you've got the Nazis tinkering around with some sort of gravitic anti-gravity thing in 1944, and you pour trillions of dollars over, what is it now, since the end of the war, 8 decades of secret research, could you develop a technology that could get us there safely and get us off of there safely? Well, probably. So I have no difficulty with the idea that we're there. And then add to that Alternative 3. You familiar with that?
Yes.
Well, for those of you who aren't, Alternative 3 was this British television show done on the ITC network in the 70s and early 80s in Great Britain, and it was called Alternative 3. And it was intended to be an April Fool's joke because it was supposed to air on April 1st on ITV.
Documentary style.
On a documentary. It's laid out and presented as a documentary. It's a complete hoax.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that happened was they were trying to explain the great brain drain from Great Britain during the 70s and 80s and investigating all these missing scientists. And they came up with these scientists were being disappeared deliberately into the secret space program.
Straight up.
And helping scientists prepare to get a segment of the human population off the planet Earth before the Earth was just uninhabitable. Okay, and so they go to Mars. As a result of the show, this is what is really interesting to me. As a result of this documentary, ITC television in Great Britain was flooded with letters and telegraphs from people all over the Commonwealth and the United States saying that, they have knew somebody that disappeared as a scientist or something that disappeared with no explanation. They don't know where they went. And they were starting to take it seriously. And then one of the guys involved in the production of the show all of a sudden starts being tailed, having his mail opened, his phone tapped, and all of this stuff. And he's thinking, okay, why is my phone and mail being tapped for a show that was a complete hoax?
Right.
So
as if they tapped into a real thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they did.
Wow.
They thought they were making something up, and it hit too close to home for somebody.
Wow, incredible.
I really do think that.
Alternative 3, I'm thinking that's about 1980.
Yeah, it's about 1980s. It's right toward the end of the 70s and the brain drain, and just at the end of that last Labor government before Mrs. Thatcher comes in. And it's a 1 hour wild ride. I got to tell you, but
it is incredible, and they play it totally straight.
And yes, they do. There's not a cracked smile in the whole thing. And interestingly enough, Daniel, in one of the scenes in that show, they interview this guy at the Royal Society of something or other, some professor. Remember that?
Yeah.
And the reporter asks him, well, what really is going on? And he pauses for a while and thinks, and he says, well, and I'm paraphrasing badly here. He says, well, it appeared to some of us watching the Soviet Union and the United States that there had to be a deeper level of cooperation and coordination going on than met the public eye. And I was bowled over when I heard that, because I had just published the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. Okay. Right. And in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I point out that you can look at Soviet and American launches, particularly of lunar probes, and compare the schedules of launches. the Soviets would send up a few probes, then they'd stop. And then the Americans would send up a few probes, and then we'd stop. And then the Soviets would, back and forth. And you can interpret that one of two ways. As the space race, they're in the race and they're trying to outdo each other. Or you can interpret that we do it, then you do it, as coordination and cooperation at a very high hidden level.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. Now, here's the question. How would you synchronize that if you were cooperating? Answer, who's got the intelligence boots on the ground inside of the Soviet Union to communicate surreptitiously? Reinhard Gehlen.
Gehlen.
Yeah.
Well, Gehlen comes directly out of the Nazi hierarchy. At the end of the war, he's running Nazi intelligence.
He's running Nazi intelligence on the Eastern Front during World War II and then post-war West German intelligence. It's the same network. In other words, it's a group of Nazis. And he's the German intelligence liaison with the CIA. Now, why do I mention him? Because he's all important. How does Lee Harvey Oswald get an apartment in Minsk, Belarusia, and then marries the colonel of the daughter of a GRU, Soviet military intelligence colonel, and then gets back out of the Soviet Union with her in tow, with money in his pocket? Who's got the network inside the Soviet Union to do that? It's not the CIA directly. Right.
Wow. Gehlen's a really unusual figure, and this is a shot of Gehlen, actually. You pointed out his autobiography to me, and I couldn't believe it when I was reading it.
Isn't that is he a piece of work or not?
Unbelievable. And my way of looking at him is he's kind of the great, he's the Wizard of Oz back there, because basically the CIA is crafted directly out of his network. Yeah, I mean, we had the OSS, but it seems like anything to do with that area of the world, he's the real. He's
the real CIA presence, and it's not CIA; it's West German.
Yes,
and it's like Christopher Simpson pointed out in his book Blowback. Gehlen's analyses of Soviet military capabilities and intentions were the briefings and analysis for the CIA to President Truman. And it was so bad at some points that they simply took Gehlen's analyses that he'd passed on to the CIA, retyped them on CIA stationery, and passed them off to President Truman. So in other words, a Nazi general is briefing the American president directly with no added comments, nothing. Truman is just reading Nazi intelligence analysis. Truman is Hitler,
Right, yeah.
living in the White House rather than the Reich Chancellery, getting these briefings, But that's essentially what's going on.
Gehlen just switched employers there.
He's just switched employers.
That's interesting what you mentioned about the Kennedy part, though, because at that period in time, so first of all, Oswald is such a strange character. On a number of fronts, trying to get into his background. Obviously, it's laced from Atsugi and everywhere else with all kinds of intelligence work. But this activity is very unusual because you can't get into the Soviet Union in 1960, 1959 if you're American. And you need something very special to get you in and out of there. Not to mention, when he went there, when he was here, he didn't really have a good job or any money, but he went there, he was all set.
He was all set in a television manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
in Minsk.
Yeah.
And the odd thing that people forget from the Warren Commission is that one of his Marine buddies overheard him not only speaking Russian, but German.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, what would you need German for?
Yeah.
Unless your handler happens to be somebody associated with General Gehlen, which stands to reason.
I found that Marina Oswald confirmed that about him speaking German. So it's definitely
there.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the Hunts and the Murchisons, who are hovering big time in the background of Kennedy's assassination. Peter Dale Scott brought this out in his book, The Deep State. They had some sort of private intelligence network, which Professor Scott was able to trace back to General Gehlen.
Yeah, amazing. And that's interesting, too, that the all-powerful oil barons, you know, H.L. Hunt, who is largely around these assassinations going on in that period. He's right there in the middle of it. And even Hughes, that they have access to this intelligence network of their own with that kind of power, you know. I think in his case, the CIA invades his corporation rather than you know, him hiring them out the way Hunt did. But that's
let's not forget who else was connected to the Hunts and Murchison. Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, what a tangled web.
What a tangled UFO web as well.
Yes, what a tangled UFO web. I'm still sort of breathless over Joseph McCarthy getting all these UFO things.
Yeah, I want to put this on the record, right? The whole UFO field, you know, they've been sputtering around, chasing around Luis Elizondo, and they're like, you know, oh, Elizondo raised his eye in a Fox News interview when they asked him a question. What does it mean? In the meantime, right in the core of history, they have Joseph McCarthy talking about Blue Book. They're going to learn a lot more. You know, just read a book.
Yeah, just read a book for crying out loud. Yeah, he's not only talking about Blue Book, but longitudinal radar experiments and what is Monmouth doing down in New Mexico in July of 1947.
Yeah, there's a date there.
Just a little date coincidence there.
I've got a couple of things for you, and then we're going to turn it over to Miss Olivia and her questions. You're watching the Dark Journalist program, everyone. We're here with Dr. Joseph Farrell. This is incredible. Deep dive into deep state space wars. A couple of headlines just to run by. This was France steps up spending for Space Force to gird for unfriendly moves, Joseph. That's a new one. Unfriendly moves. And then this brave leader, Macron, Germany is wary of his Space Force.
Well, do you blame them? I seem to recall a little guy by the name of Napoleon that gave the Germans some pause for concern.
And it's interesting when we talk about space, we can't really talk about space without at least mentioning that there's an occult aspect to all of this. And that means if we're talking about, you know, JPL, or if we're talking about the moon landings and the numerology involved, the things that they did, the Masonic rituals when they got to the moon. You mentioned Richard Hoagland's work. He's tracked that a lot. He has a whole group, he says, inside of NASA called the Magicians. One of the things that you pointed out to me, and I just wanted to touch base with you on this, was during the 9/11 attacks, there was a very unusual piece of occult imagery that beamed across every television set. I'm going to show the picture. I know it's disturbing, but it's just the nature of getting the point across. This is one of the jumpers from the tower, and he's in a very unusual pose, and that was shot across the world. Now, in traditional occultism, in the tarot, we see that pose in the hangman. He's upside down. He's got that same unusual posturing. I went back and got a few examples of this to really make sure we knew what we were talking about. There's something about that positioning. And then I went back into the very early versions of The Wizard of Oz, and that Tin Man holding that same exact positioning. Of course, in The Wizard of Oz, we've got that theosophical background that Baum had. So he's plugged into all this, and that's just more Hanged Man. Whether we're talking about the moon landings or JFK or 9/11, in JFK, of course, you've got the tramps, and you pointed out to me there was something very unusual in Masonic ritualistic about that.
Yeah.
When you get into the space part, what are they doing? What's going on there on the occult side?
Well, in a nutshell, if you agree with Hoagland's analysis and other people that have looked at that, and I do, what I think they are doing is a vast celestial ritual magic.
Right.
And the reason that they're doing it, again, goes back to what I think may have happened in the national security state after the war. And that is, all of a sudden, they're confronted with a UFO problem. And as they go back and examine historical texts and lore, they are doing this as a way, perhaps, to either communicate in ways that they think might have been done in occult lore, because in a lot of that lore, you deal with the timing of something and you deal with the manipulation of symbols. Those are the two most important things.
Right.
And clearly they're doing that. They're either trying to communicate, or I suspect that some of them, the magicians, are aptly named because they are trying to manipulate or control those forces. So they may be trying to summon and manipulate. And I don't put it past these people to do that.
Right.
Because you have, particularly with people like Jack Parsons, you mentioned JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which
right.
Parsons was absolutely intimately involved in setting up. Clearly, with that man, you have not only a brilliant scientist, but you have someone who's very heavily into the occult. I mean, he's connected with Aleister Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
He's performing, the Babylon ritual and all of this.
Right.
And he's doing so in conjunction with his space efforts. So there's no doubt in my mind that they are trying to use space in a magical way. None whatsoever.
And Hubbard's in that.
Hubbard is involved in that whole circle around Jack Parsons. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
So there's no doubt in my mind that carried over into NASA and is very well hidden. I mean, when Buzz Aldrin is performing some sort of Masonic communion ceremony
right.
on the surface of the moon, there's something more going on than just sticking a flag on the moon saying we made it.
Right.
There's something very, very definitely other going on, and I emphasize other.
Right. And if they're in the middle, these are conjuring ceremonies.
Yes.
You've pointed out some of the dates are quite fascinating. I mean, the moon landing itself.
Yeah, the first moon landing is July 20th, 1969, the 25th anniversary of the unsuccessful assassination plot on Adolf Hitler.
Wow.
Tom Cruise's movie, Valkyrie.
Right.
The date itself is a little significant, and it's, I've said this before, it makes me wonder just who they were talking about when they said the eagle has landed. Well, whose eagle?
You're right.
And how did we get there?
Yeah.
A bunch of Nazi scientists designing a Saturn V rocket and who knows what else.
Yeah. Oh, I know. You see that thing land, and it looks like, a tent from a thrift shop or something. You look at it, you say, there's no way it's going to get off.
Right, right.
So there is something really interesting about that. When I think about the occult end of things in relation to this, I mean, CERN has the occult scientific blend.
Oh yeah, big time.
You pointed out about so many things about CERN in the Third Wave book. It's an excellent book about its original, and that's the Large Hadron Collider that we're talking about in relation to CERN. But CERN, of course, is that nuclear agency. It's they're the ones who create the whole thing. And they have a new CERN coming out, which is 5 times bigger than the original, 2022. And the budget for that's $20 billion. We used to think that $6 billion was a lot, but $20 billion on that one. Along with their other facility, Large Hadron Collider, which is ALICE, and it has all this Alice in Wonderland. So they're moving. They're moving these occult style aspects in scientifically as well.
Yeah, absolutely, they are. Now, I'm not one of those. There's a certain individual out there who's come up with all sorts of, quite literally, Saturnalia about CERN based on his interpretation of the Bible.
Yes.
And it's all jumbled in with quantum mechanics. And
that's wild stuff.
That's wild stuff. I'm not there, but clearly there are occult symbolisms that surround that institution. And I have my own suspicions of what they might be really up to, and it's not particle physics. To build an even bigger one that's going to require magnets with Tesla strengths that are going to dwarf the Large Hadron Collider, to me, that is a planetary magnetic resonance device more than anything else.
Wow,
that's scary, because I happen to think that by resonance, what they're trying to do is use the planetary magnetic field to manipulate the suns. In other words, we're demonstrating a class 2 Kardashev capability to whomever might be interested.
Right, yeah. Onlookers.
Yeah. Don't mess with us or we'll blow up the sun.
Should we take some questions? Let's take some questions. Miss Olivia.
Okay, we'll start here. Ed Kaufman. I sense that Peter Levenda is a consultant to TTSA on all matters related to the occult. What is Joseph's opinion on it?
Well, if you're going to get anyone to be an occult consultant for the TTSA, it would be Peter Levenda.
Yeah, right.
Most people may be unaware, but many, many years ago, there was a fellow by the name of Simon that published a book called The Necronomicon.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's Peter Levenda.
Wow. He was writing under a pseudonym.
Yeah. The case has been fairly solidly made now. If you delve into it, you can find stuff out about it online. And additionally, Levenda has an ecclesiastical background, and he knows enough about that. And the ecclesiastical background that he had was in a very small Eastern Orthodox jurisdiction in this country. It was under a fellow by the name of Andrei Prosky, Metropolitan Andrei, that had strong intelligence ties. So if you're going to get someone with financial expertise, occult expertise, knows Christian theology, and has some sort of odd association with intelligence agencies, that's the man to get.
We know that they court people in this independent environment trying to get people to plug into for their work. They courted you to do the exact same thing that Peter's doing.
Oh, yeah.
And it didn't work out.
No. They, I had an experience at Oxford. There was a British gentleman that came to the Heineken Guinness famine relief debate that we had. And of course, I was there blathering my mouth off. And he invited me around to St. John's College for tea. Now, if you know anything about the college system in Oxford, you know that there are certain colleges where either the Labour Party or the Tory Party or MI5 or MI6 do their recruiting. And St. John's was right at the top of the list.
Oh, yeah.
So I immediately I accepted the invitation. And I went around and had tea with the gentleman in St. John's Middle Commons room. And he made polite conversation for about 5 minutes and then asked me if I'd ever considered a career in foreign service. Oh. I'm thinking MI6 has come calling.
Wow.
And I said, well, no, thank you, sir. I understand your invitation, but I'm, number one, not interested in committing treason.
Right.
But yeah, that really happened. And strange stuff has followed me ever since then. I was in Oxford during Mr. Reagan's strike against Libya. And I went out one evening to get a malt at the McDonald's just a few blocks up from my college. And I got my malt. As I was walking up there, I kept noticing these footsteps behind me that were exactly even with me. They would never speed up. They would never slow down. If I slowed down, they'd slow down. If I sped up, they'd speed up. So I thought, okay, I'm being tailed by somebody. And, that's nothing for Oxford. But I went around the corner heading towards the Oxford Union, and the steps followed me on this little empty, narrow English street. And I thought, okay, someone really is following me. So I turned the corner again and headed back down and rounded around a little shoe shop, and entered into the doorway to that shoe shop so that they couldn't see me. And they come bounding around the corner. And I stepped out and confronted the guy. He was about 3 feet from me. I said, "Are you following me, sir?" And his partner had, in the meantime, gone across and talked to a constable that was sitting in his police car across the street. And the guy looked at me and he says, "Are you Joseph P. Farrell?" And I said, "Yes." And he was speaking with an American accent. And he says, "You're at Pembroke College?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "And let me guess, you're from the Air Force Base north of town?" And he didn't answer. He just turned around, hollered out to his partner across the street, "Yeah, it's him." And they both walked away.
What on earth?
Yeah. So yeah, I've had stuff like that happen to me a lot.
What did you conclude on that one?
Well, I suspected that because Reagan had launched his airstrikes against Gaddafi at the time, that basically they were simply out there trying to identify American citizens that were in the proximity of the Air Force Base.
Right.
Just to keep a tab on everybody.
Right.
Make sure that, everybody was okay. I don't think it was anything sinister.
Mm.
It may have been, who
It's
knows?
unusual.
It's a little disheartening,
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you look at just the kind of work that you do, you get a certain profile for these people.
Mm-hmm.
And, you go forward and do your work anyway. That's the nature of the beast. I do think it's interesting in the case of like a TTSA or whatever, because they reached out to you also, and they wanted you to join, like Lavenda, on that train. And that didn't wind up happening. And the thing is, I think that that's what they do. I think they hang out spotting for people that they can move. And then for somebody, I would think like a Lavenda type guy, it's a job.
Yeah.
And I don't think he has any great loyalty for TTSA.
No, I think he's probably a consultant, just like you say.
Yeah,
a freelance consultant. I'm certainly not thinking he's some sort of spy.
right.
He has, for one thing, he has too high of a profile for that sort of activity. But he could be kind of a low key spy. Well, if you notice anything on your travels unusual, let us know, that sort of thing.
Right.
But an actual operative, no. But yeah, that stuff goes on all the time. We know about Bill Cooper and
Yes.
there's all sorts of people in the field of ufology that have reported similar experiences, and it's nothing new. It goes with the territory, like you say.
How about Catherine Fitt's lunch with aliens?
Well, yeah, I mean, that to me is the classic story, that she's been invited, oh, by the way, if you want to have lunch with an alien, come around and see us, drop in, and her response, it would have been exactly like mine. Well, are these guys trying to frame me for something, or are they serious?
Yeah, right. Here comes an experiment of some kind.
Yeah, here comes an experiment of some kind. So yeah, it goes on. It does, and I know people think that we make this stuff up, but I'm as serious as a clam. These things have happened to me. I've had mail opened and all sorts of stuff. So
I'll tell you one thing that's interesting, and I got it from the late Stanton Friedman before he passed away, and it was in relation to John Mack. And he said that he had gone looking for information of people looking into the life of John Mack, and it was extraordinary the amount of surveillance that Mack had on him at the time, being a Harvard professor and talking about the UFO thing in a way that they couldn't control. That's quite fascinating. I think it's an idea that when they can't spin it, forget it.
Yeah. If they're dealing with mavericks or independent researchers, my impression is they keep an eye on things, just, you know, for nothing else other than to monitor what people are talking about or thinking. You know, you'd expect them to do that. So I'm not surprised that it goes on, particularly with people like Mac.
I was contacted by a person who was involved in one of these cases around Mac, and it was a high-profile case, and I'll get into it at some point, but the crux of it is, when he went to report it to this police station, this big UFO encounter, they had him wait there for a while, and he came back to me, and he's a very credible guy, and he said the person who came back and sort of semi-interrogated him and then tailed him for a while was Elizondo, the same guy who's the spokesman now for this CIA disclosure thing. That's
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
No, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised.
These are the kind of people I think we're talking about on that kind of false UFO disclosure thing. Fascinating. Miss Olivia.
Z-Beat. Who in the government has communication with other world entities, if anyone?
Who in the government, Joseph?
I would wager that most of that's going to be coming out of two agencies, one, possibly three or four, certainly the CIA. And I think that would probably come out of a long involvement with MK Ultra. The other one would be the Defense Intelligence Agency, that would have a natural interest in any sort of intelligence that it could glean or get from any sort of contact like that. The other two that I would strongly suspect would be the NSA, because let's assume that the government did pick up some sort of signal, communication signal, from somebody else out there. The NSA would be the natural agency you'd turn over to try and decrypt it.
Right.
And there are, incidentally, some things on the internet that allege to be NSA documents attempting to do just that. And then the final organization that I could imagine doing that would be something like the National Reconnaissance Office, that handles all the spy satellites and so on. So those would be the four agencies I'd look at. And then, of course, we have, as a matter of historical record, the X-Files, literally, of the FBI that deal with Project X, which is UFOs.
Right.
So we can add the FBI into that as perhaps a counterintelligence operation that would be interested in monitoring anything like that. So I would say those four plus the FBI as a matter of historical record.
You know, that's fascinating. And it makes me think of something, which is, when you look back at that period when this was first exploding, the 50s and the 60s, if we were to cut the cases that we think are psyops, it seems like there are a lot of these kind of normal type, almost like businessmen, coming in and meeting. You hear all these stories, and they come in and they meet with officials of the royal family, or they're always involved around these contact cases. And it seems like there's some concerted effort by somebody to either pretend that they're aliens coming here to contact us, but they look just like us and they're normal, or, it's some thing that everyone is tuning into in that period. There's a lot of reports from fairly credible people. I was reading one from an admiral in the UK, and he gives this whole story about, and he was like, I was close with this royal and all the rest of it, and they had these experiences. What do you think is going on there? Because they're not men in black.
Right. Well, if let's look at it from another point of view. If contact is real,
right,
then it stands to reason that there would be contact at a very high level at some point, particularly if you are of the philosophy or school that royal bloodlines descend from earlier contact.
Right.
That stands to reason. And since you mentioned the admiral, there's another joker in the pack as far as I'm concerned, and that's Dorothy Kilgallen. Because she was the reporter's reporter back at that time, and especially being a female in investigative journalism at that time was very, very difficult. But she had a nationwide following that read her columns, and she was not afraid to tackle, at the time when it was almost suicidal in any mainstream media to do so, she was not afraid to tackle the UFO issue.
Right.
And she did talk with high authorities in the British Ministry of Defense and in the Pentagon. And of course, she was also, sniffing out Jack Ruby and that whole JFK thing, and had made several trips to Dallas and New Orleans. And I wonder sometimes if she had not made some sort of connection between the two. It would be like her to do so, because she was a dot connector par excellence.
Yeah.
So, I've always wondered about that aspect of her death.
No question. Very mysterious death, and all the work that she had disappeared.
Yep.
At that time, very high profile hit.
Oh yes, very, very. People have to remember she was a national figure. I mean, you can go on YouTube and see videos of her on What's My Line. She was a regular panelist on that show. So she was very popular. She was very well known. She was widely respected as a columnist, and she had a brain, and she was able to connect dots. So I've always been kind of suspicious about her and this whole UFO thing. What went on with her death? Was it simply just about JFK, or did she make some sort of connection? It's hard not to.
Right.
If you examine all the strange goings on in New Orleans with Guy Bannister, there's your FBI X-Files character, with Lee Harvey Oswald trying to get a job at NASA.
Right.
And, it stands to reason, Daniel, that she would have found out some of that information very quickly and very easily. And if that's the case, she may have started putting things together in a very interesting and unusual way, which would have been like her.
Right. And there's something behind all that which suggests it's knowledge of the UFO file mixed with political assassination, and there are aerospace companies involved. It's this corridor, which is very different than like, hey, it's Cubans and mafia and all the rest of it.
Totally different.
Yeah.
Totally. And there's no doubt in my mind that is at some level involved in the Kennedy assassination. None whatsoever.
Right.
None whatsoever.
Yeah. Fascinating. Miss Olivia.
Joseph, everyone is predicting an alien invasion. False flag.
They are?
Yes.
In the ideas room they are.
Well, it's what will top off 2020.
There's a meme going around about this, that, after this, an alien invasion must be next. Vice and, all these other publications are promoting that as kind of like a meme. But I will say this about it, which is at the height of this lockdown thing, the Pentagon's rolled out the same videos that the New York Times had rolled out 2 years earlier.
Yep.
And they pushed the whole UFO thing for no reason, almost because they were like, hey, everyone's at home, let's do this.
Yeah.
So what's the bombshell?
Well, I liked this question. Has the alien invasion already happened? And if so, when? Are they walking among us?
Well, I entertain the possibility. And simply because of all the research I've done with ancient texts and so on and so forth, and that whole narrative of human contact and angelic interbreeding with humans or whatever they were, I entertain it as a possibility for the precise reason that every indication in those texts is that they look like us. In other words, they're humanoid form.
Right.
And you can see, particularly in some of the ancient Babylonian and Sumerian seal cylinders, when you roll them out and take a picture of what they produce when they're rolled out on clay, you'll see pictures of tiny little humans bringing gifts to a great big large human seated on a throne. And of course, Quackademia says, well, that large figure is simply they're trying to depict the Lugal A. They're trying to depict the king. The big man is literally what it means. But I'm thinking that you've got so many stories from the Bible to Sumeria and even some Vedic literature about giants,
right,
that that might be true. So how then, if you're dealing with a humanoid population, how then would you know if someone is of the species Homo sapiens sapiens and not of the genus Homo that is another species? Well, the only way to do that would be genetically. You'd have to test the DNA.
right.
And I've maintained for quite some time that I'm very suspicious of all of these platforms online and the government's hurry to get everybody in a DNA database.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, why? Why do they want to do this? And I can think of several reasons. They want to own us, that we're property, as Charles Fort said, and that they might be trying to identify parts of the population that look human that may not be entirely so. So, there's all sorts of stuff going on that I don't rule out of the picture that they may be among us. And that dovetails precisely with some of those texts that I've talked about publicly, like Enoch,
Yeah.
where you have the idea of watchers left behind to monitor us. Well, if you're going to spy on people, you have to look like the people you're going to spy on.
Right.
It's just that simple. So, I don't rule it out of the picture. I don't.
You said something there about Enoch, and I was thinking, in this book, you mentioned that there was a whole program to surveil the Black Knight satellite back there in this period. And the Black Knight satellite is weird because we didn't have the satellite technology available for when it was first spotted. So somebody else had it up there.
Yeah. I mean, if the story is true, yeah, that's what it amounts to. Who's putting things up in polar orbit?
Right.
And
I guess that's
big things, big things, not small little Sputnik things, but rather sizable things.
Yes.
So, there's all sorts of stories out there. And if you take them at their word, what they amount to is somebody's watching us.
Right.
And I don't rule it out of the picture. If you believe in the idea of extraterrestrials to begin with, then the stories make sense.
Right.
And there's little other way that they do make sense unless you resort to some extraordinary hypotheses that, Alan Alford being an example, that, this is all metaphor of comets striking the earth.
Right. Yeah.
From Christ to the Sumerians and so on. It's all nothing but comets. I don't think people were willing to be fed to the lions because they believed in the eternal comet.
Right.
The narrative doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
But the problem with those narratives is if you exclude the idea from your thinking ab initio that you're dealing with extraterrestrials of some sort, then you're left with proposing nonsense hypotheses. And that's always been the big problem for me with dealing with these texts, is there's too many people willing to dismiss them and not take them at their word.
Is there absolutely, is there a Sumerian version of Enoch? Because I'm
yes, there is. I'm trying to recall what the name of it is. Oh golly.
Because I remember there's something in there where he says he's going up and he looks down and the earth looks like porridge. And that's pretty good description.
Yeah, I know I don't remember what the name of it is right off the top of my head, Daniel, but I think there is something like that. And even, the problem with Enoch is that it comes in different versions. And for the life of me, I can't explain why the Slavonic version is the most interesting, because that would date it later than the other texts. So I'm thinking that there's some sort of underground stream that, leads to that textual recension.
You can see, alien or not, very active technology in versions.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Ezekiel's story, of course.
Yeah.
Wheel within a wheel. There's a Casey reading that deals with Ezekiel.
I remember it.
This is pretty unusual, because he said,
a very unusual reading.
They ask him and they say, well, will you tell us what the Atlantean technology was like? What kind of sort of flying machines did they have and all the rest? And he says, well, they're such as were described by Ezekiel at a much later date, which is really puzzling, because it gives you the idea that what Ezekiel is describing is Atlantean ships.
Well, there's that interesting passage in Ezekiel about Lucifer. Thy tabrets and pipes were made perfect in thee.
Right.
And it's, you can read that in two ways. You can read it as describing an organism, pipes, intestines, tabrets, membranes, or you can read it as describing a technology, a machine.
Right. Wow, incredible.
I did a little paper on that in the members area on my website. And, to put it bluntly, the way the world is going, it looks like we're being managed by some sort of malign artificial intelligence that's completely cold to all things human.
Yes.
Just think of Dr. Fauci and this ridiculous nose bag thing that we've got going on. Don't get too close to each other. And I heard one county in Florida was even thinking about mandating the nose bag if you're in your own home. I'm sorry, no, that ain't happening.
Hey, that's
not here.
You draw the line somewhere.
The line somewhere. Sooner or later it's going to come down to shooting. If they start going down that route. But
no question about it. There's no question about it. It's going to get there if they pursue that. There's no question. I mean, logical people can see it coming.
Well, the state of Nevada, the Supreme Court just passed on ruling about the state of Nevada's restrictions on some little church in Las Vegas, and yet the casinos can, be open. Jeez. Yeah, really? the magic virus only works in churches, folks, but not in casinos.
And don't try to sing in a church.
No, don't sing either. I can just see that one going down in an Orthodox synagogue or a mosque. It ain't happening, folks.
I hate to even say it, but the Bill Gates condom is, it's in the pipeline. Unbelievable.
No kidding. Since you mentioned that, Daniel, I'm just waiting for them to come out with some sort of regulation about how and when and at what distance and how often you can have sex and in what position, so that you don't get the magic virus.
And King Gates he'll have like a blackboard and lay it all out.
That's right. You got to wear this condom, not that one. Jeez. These people are wacky. They're just wacky.
And anyway. Fauci flattened the curve. Fauci, you're fired. This is what Trump should have done a long time ago.
Oh, absolutely. The guy is so dirty.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable to me. Trump is wondering why his support is so soft. I'm absolutely convinced it's the way he's handled this thing, his ambiguous statements on mandatory vaccines.
Oh yeah.
I'm convinced that his support is soft for precisely this reason, and no one wants to go there.
When I look at history, I see that there was a big campaign. And it was strange because it was Ronald Reagan, and originally he was losing, and they could not figure out what the problem was. And the problem was he had these stage managers who were making him say and do certain things. And at a certain point, somebody came forward and said, "Let Reagan be Reagan."
Yes.
Right? And then when they let him out of the cage, he won, because that's why they liked him in the first place.
Right.
So Trump has to remember what got him in there in the first place and not dance around and try to play Mr. Vaccine, because that's not going to work for him. It'll sink him.
Yeah.
And we'll get catatonic Biden, you know.
Oh, jeez. Well, don't get me started. I mean, the poor guy,
I know.
they've got him locked up in his basement because they don't want to let him out to talk. But I saw something on YouTube of nothing but a collection. You've got to search for this, folks. It's called The Poetry of Joe Biden.
Oh.
And it's it's some guy reading Joe Biden quotes like he's a beatnik in a 50s coffee house, smoking his cigarette with the bongo drums going on in the background. And it's just as funny as all get out. The Poetry of Joe Biden. If you take nothing away from this interview, take that away. Go watch it.
Everyone's writing it down as we speak.
Everyone's writing it down.
Miss Olivia.
Okay. Bethany Green, how about a little comment about the CRISPR tech and the vaccine that changes our DNA?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Look, I Catherine Fitz and I call this not only the magic virus, but the Bill Gates Microsoft model of vaccination. They're already talking about updates. In other words, you got to have more than one.
Oh yeah,
you know. So they're gonna inject you until you're so sick you can't get out of bed.
Right.
It's the Microsoft update model of vaccinations, and I've seen this business of the genetic modification in the vaccine. So I have to wonder, going back to the ET Among Us thing, what really are they doing that for? Because we've never encountered what essentially is a flu virus, where they're talking about modifying your ribosomal mitochondrial DNA in a vaccine.
Wow.
And here's something to remember, folks. Vaccines are not subject to anywhere near the strenuous research requirements that are necessary for drugs.
Right.
Plus, they get an immunity. So, in other words, you are going to be receiving something, if they push this through, that has no intergenerational testing on its long-term effects on the human population and or the environment. So this is the GMO nightmare all over again and on steroids.
Unbelievable.
And, do you want to take this genetic gunk, whatever they decide to put into it, and end up having a children that's half human and half pig or whatever?
Right.
Because they're doing those kinds of experiments too. So I have to wonder just what the agenda is behind all of this. I don't think it's simply about vaccinating people. And it's being pushed by a man with clear connections to eugenics and Malthusian ideas in his family. And that concerns me because he's already come out and said, well, we got to give it to black people first.
Yeah, right. I know.
Because they're the most susceptible to all of this. Again, it's the magic virus. Whoever we need to get rid of, well, we vaccinate them first.
Yeah.
So, I smell an agenda here that's absolutely nothing other than diabolical, in my opinion.
No question.
There's, they're going to have to give me that needle in my cold, dead body because it ain't happening.
Yeah.
Period. They're going to have to ship me off to a FEMA death camp and forcibly do it.
Yeah.
But I am so skeptical of this idea, especially when you mention CRISPR. And let's go back to Dr. Charles Lever of Harvard University that was arrested for having allegedly lied to the federal government about his ties to the Wuhan virology laboratory in Wuhan, China, where all of this started.
Yes.
And what's his specialty? His specialty is nanotechnology.
Right.
And I've suspected all along, I've even blogged about it, that you may be looking at a magic virus in the true sense, a virus that can only be activated under certain electromagnetic conditions.
Uh-huh.
And when you start adding in genetic preponderance and co-mortality factors in certain segments of the population, blacks, Hispanics. The latest target population I've heard recently is the Hispanics. After the blacks, then we got to get the Hispanics.
All right.
You know, I'm sorry. I think all the indicators are there with anyone with two neurons that stitch together in a synapse that they are up to something truly diabolical.
No question.
I think, you know, the indicators are that this was a plan that they had long ago. You know, Fauci came out in 2017 and said, well, Trump's going to have to face a pandemic. Well, how do you know that?
Yeah.
Anthony, what crystal ball are you gazing into? I suspect that this was a plan that they had ready to hand for when Darth Hillary won the election, but that didn't happen. So, but then they rethought it and said, well, we can use this to accomplish a number of objectives. So yeah, I'm suspicious of the whole 9 yards.
How do you rate the public's reaction at this point?
To what exactly?
To this whole op and the restrictions and everything else.
Well, I think the public is getting awfully dang tired of being told who they can associate with, how far they have to stand from them. I think enough people are aware of the fact that this is a narrative, that it's going to collapse, and it could collapse if they keep it up. It could collapse forcibly. That's what worries me.
Yeah.
There's a certain segment of the population that's buying this whole narrative. I think
they're locked in through the media.
Yeah, this is the problem. You cannot enforce a narrative that requires human beings. We're essentially social creatures, even hermits like me. You cannot lock them into this sort of situation where you're telling them where they can go, what they can do, particularly in their houses of worship, and not just churches. I'm thinking synagogues, mosques, you name it. You cannot keep people in a situation where they're forced to do inhuman things for too long, because eventually that is going to blow up in your face.
Yeah.
It's just dollars to donuts. It's going to blow up in their faces if they keep doing this stuff. And when you have the Supreme Court passing off on making a decision that is clearly a constitutional decision, which they have the right to do under judicial review,
right,
not making a decision about the state of Nevada, and I'm quoting here, claiming a new power to legally, their words, legally discriminate. Legally discriminate for public health or economic reasons. That is the full court press. That's the full court press.
And the Supreme Court passed the buck.
Passed the buck. Yes.
John
Roberts again. Yeah,
what has happened to John Roberts?
I think there's a control file on it.
Yeah.
I think there's a control file
These
on
are
it.
bizarre decisions for him.
Totally.
On a number of issues.
Oh yeah, totally. You know, Obamacare, it's a tax.
Right.
No, it's not a tax. You know, that's clear to anybody with half a brain.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's a control file somewhere. But you know, the thing that bothers me about that is it's yet another decision that has come down where people are trying to work within the system and the system betrays them.
Right.
So you can't keep this narrative up forever. I mean, you know, the country literally is at stake.
Yeah.
It literally is at stake. We are in, I've said this before many times, we are in a de facto hot civil cultural war right now, whether we want to admit it or not. We're at our Harper's Ferry version 2.0 moment.
That's it.
You know, that's it.
Yeah.
Trump is President Buchanan version 2.0.
Yes.
You are dealing with a country with two contradictory cultures, and one or the other is going to win out.
Wow.
It's just the way it is.
Fascinating. And do you have any more on that?
I got a question of my own.
Yes.
Where does Satanism fit into all this?
Oh, I think it's clear if you've got any sort of spiritual inclinations whatsoever that what you're watching is diabolical.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It is completely diabolical, because you're looking at one very vocal, vociferous violent aspect of the culture that is trying to impose its will by force on the other part of it, which is the vast majority. And the interesting clue here about them is that they have a program of nothing but nihilism. They're not really clear about what they want to replace it with. They're just against everything.
Exactly.
And that's coming straight out of the pit of hell.
Yeah. Yeah, no question about it. What you're supposed to absorb as normal, they keep using the terms new normal.
New normal.
Different things, yeah. This is, don't send your kids to school. Don't go to your job. Don't open your restaurant.
Don't open your restaurant. Don't sing in church. Don't get closer than 6 feet to everybody. This is way beyond the wildest imaginations of Joseph Stalin.
Oh, yeah.
It is, like it or not. I mean, nutty as he was. And by the way, I've got a movie called The Death of Stalin. Have you seen that?
No.
Oh, it's a British comedy.
Oh.
And it's got Nikita Khrushchev, Malenkov, Beria, all the malcontents.
I love it already.
Trying to figure out what to do because they discover Stalin, of course, dead of a stroke in a pool of his own urine. And go watch the trailers for it. I've been waiting. It came today. I've been waiting. That's what I'm going to watch.
Movie recommendations.
My movie recommendation I haven't even seen the movie. I've just seen the trailers. But if the movie's anything like the trailers, it's a pip. But that's my movie watching tonight after we get done. But anyway, yeah, this is wild. This is beyond the wildest dreams of Joseph Stalin. To regulate and insist that you have the power at a local and state level to regulate human behavior in this fashion, no, I'm sorry, is clearly unconstitutional.
Oh, yeah. No question about it. They have floated since the beginning of this in articles in Newsweek and elsewhere. This whole idea of continuity of government and CoG. Now, we know this has been completely under wraps for years, and it's taken certain types of researchers, Professor Scott, to dig it out and bring it up. And generally, the vast majority of the population doesn't know anything about it.
Right.
So they were rolling out, when we did some shows about it, this general, Terence O'Shaughnessy, and showing him locked up there in this big bunker in the Colorado mountain and all that. And they were rolling out this idea that, well, if Trump gets coronavirus, this guy takes over. That was basically the theme of the articles by William Arkin. And it's interesting because when I had asked Professor Scott about Arkin, he said, well, he leaves a lot of things out on purpose, which I think is interesting. But one of the things I found interesting was that recently, although they've been kind of rolling this out on a regular basis, Gary Hart, who was president, you may remember. President.
Yes, I do. George McGovern 2.0.
He was the presidential candidate, and he was going to really take it on in '88. But what happened was, in Bimini, of all places, he gets caught with his mistress. And he, there's this whole thing, and Gary Hart becomes kind of like the poster boy for bad behavior, and that's it. His political dreams are gone. However, he hung around, and he had a career before that. He was part of the Church Committee looking into CIA atrocities and assassinations. And he hung around and continued to interact with that political process. Just didn't run for office. So now, literally just a couple of days ago, he came out in the New York Times and he wrote an article which was called How Powerful is the President? It's an op-ed. But really, it's all about continuity of government. And he asks a very interesting question, which I want to ask you. He says, the question to be addressed is talking about emergency powers where this continuity of government can take over. He says, where did these secret powers come from? Where are they kept? Who has access to them? What qualifies as a national emergency sufficient to suspend virtually all constitutional protection. And then he finishes with, critically, why must these powers be secret? What's going on there?
If I were to guess where the people are that are part of that continuity of government operation, which basically has been around, in my opinion, since the McCarran Committee, from another one of those committees from the 1950s with the McCarran Act. I think you see the beginnings, the public disclosure of it begin there. My guess is you're looking primarily at some sort of hidden group or committee that is largely clustered around the CIA FBI liaison.
Right.
Because the Central Intelligence Agency is an agency for whom? If you look at the composition of many of its bigwigs, particularly in the early days, you find they're coming out of the Ivy League, they're coming out of Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles. Right. They're coming out of Wall Street. So I think it's an agency for the financial power in this country, much more than it's an agency of the federal government. That's why it acts so independently.
Right.
And it was designed to do that. So I think you look there for all of this stuff. Then you have to look at something else. Let's be honest. Most of the current continuity of government plans, that, as far as I'm aware, were drawn up by our wonderful friend Dick Cheney.
Yes.
To reverse my normal statement, when you're dealing with Dick Cheney, you're dealing with Martin Bormann, but without the warmth and charm. I think you're dealing with people like that have a strong presence in the defense industries as well. So the continuity of government is largely a private operation, in my opinion. It's a corporate operation rather than a federal operation. They're just disguising it as such. So the powers are secret in the sense that they understand their definition of national emergency, but they are not disclosing that to the public. So virtually anything could be used as an excuse. The problem is I think they're dealing with Trump, with someone that has enough of a faction behind him that if they were to pull something like that, it could perhaps split the country for real.
Yeah. Yes.
Which I think is an inevitability at this point anyway. The way these governors are operating, they're operating independently because the central government has become so weak.
Right. Oh, I've never seen anything like it with the governors.
It's unreal. It's unreal. Yeah, we have a governor here in the state I live. He's effectively a rhino. He got elected because he's a good evangelical Christian. Mm-hmm. But, a few weeks ago, he got on the radio and basically was telling people, stay at home, don't go to church, watch a church service on TV. And I'm like, okay, that works for you evangelical people. Doesn't work for us sacramental people. You can't take communion by watching it.
Right.
It doesn't happen that way. And they're assuming a jurisdiction over any sort of religious body, not just Christian, but Jewish, Islam, all of it. And that's not going to play out well for them. It's just not going to play out well for them. So, they're out of control, but they're out of control because the central government is so weak. And it's not Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump. I think this is a long-term cultural development that's happening because the trust in the central government, I think, began to break down dramatically with 9/11.
Yes.
And the subsequent Shrub administration, as I like to call it, or George the Stupid, as I also like to call him, that whole projection of American power, as we've seen, hasn't worked out too well.
Right.
It was done. It was done on a lie. It was done to feather the nests of his political cronies,
Right.
and nothing more. And I think the cynicism is so deep now that everybody just kind of senses the weakness of the federal government.
Right.
And they're doing this. And, add to that the open talk of secession in many states. Well, I thought we settled that one in 1865, but apparently we didn't.
Right. Well, Idaho, they talked about forming with Oregon their own thing.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, I have to say, seeing that talk come out of this. I can understand in a sense where it's coming from with all.
Oh, sure, I can too.
But I would say this, that you're going right to the heart of it, because Pelosi, for example, a few days ago, she came out of plastic surgery just for this one.
Yes.
She shows up and she says, "Oh, I just got a briefing from Continuity of Government. I'm second in line, I mean, first of all, do math. You're third in line.
Yeah.
And there's no way in any continuity that you're going to be anything. So there's something weird there, though, where they're floating different ideas. They have the problem with Biden as the candidate. They have this idea that if they kind of make the election unreal, unmeasurable in some sense, that by the time you get to January 20th, and this is funny too, because when they had the Gore-Bush deadlock, there was no talk about continuity of government or anything. They went through this process. There was a Supreme Court thing about the hanging chads in Florida and all that. So suddenly she comes out and she makes some very weird statements. She said, "We're going to fumigate Trump out of the White House." This is really weird language.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of psychotic, right? I mean, even in political ways, I've seen politicians go at each other for years. They were talking about fumigating each other. I mean, this is
she was told they're going to, inject some sort of gas into the White House and kill them all. But right. Which I don't put anything past these people at this point. Here's my problem with what she said and what others have been saying on both sides of the political aisle. The Republic thugs are saying similar things if you listen to them carefully. What they're doing, in my opinion, is they're prepping a narrative.
Right.
Because it's apparent, at least to me, that whichever side wins in November, there is a strong possibility that it will be a contested election. Contested how, I don't know, but I think there's a certain segment on both sides of the aisle that won't accept the results regardless of who wins.
Right.
So they're prepping a narrative, it looks to me, in order to create the ground to contest the election results regardless of who wins. Both sides are doing this.
Yes.
And to me, again, I go back to what I've said before. To me, this is the Harper's Ferry President Buchanan moment of history all over again.
Yeah.
Because you saw similar things being said back in the tail end of the 1850s, both in the North and in the South, because they were realizing, as a matter of cultures, the two were diametrically opposed to each other. And only one or the other was going to be able to, create a stable nation. It was a cultural phenomenon. And I'm not talking just about slavery. There was a lot of other stuff going on in the background that was all related to it. And, the way I'm looking at it, we're at that impasse now. Both parties, as a result of events since 9/11, have become radicalized by elements within each party that have exercised an influence on the national party that is way out of proportion to the numbers. This is particularly true of the Democrats right now, but you can see the same phenomenon going on in the Republican Party. So I'm not optimistic about this election. Our side may win, whatever side that you may be on, but you got to realize that win is occurring in a situation where there's no political discourse at all anymore. There's no compromise from either side. That is a dangerous situation.
Oh yeah, if we don't like it, we just censor your comments. That's it.
Well, here's another factor to bear in mind. You've got Mr. Globaloney and Mr. Central Bankster that have piled up so much debt in the system and so many federal obligations in the system. How do you walk away from those?
Right.
Secession.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how you walk away from them all. Split the country. Yeah.
So there's a huge financial incentive to do it.
There's a huge financial incentive for these people to do this. Absolutely. That's why I think you have both the left and the right with these secession movements. Now, the movements primarily on the right, as far as I can tell, you mentioned Idaho and Oregon. Well, imagine living in Oregon where your whole state policy is dictated by Portland. You know, it's like California.
Right.
You know, the whole state, California is still a relatively conservative state when you look at it in terms of the geographic distribution.
Oh, yeah.
You know, but it's being run by a cabal, and I use that word advisedly, that's being run out of San Fran Freak Show and Scary Mental, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got essentially a policy, uniform policy being set for the whole state that the state itself is not in favor of. Right. And it's effectively a one-party state like Oregon. So out come the secessionists on both the left and right in California. And the people on the right in California are talking about, well, we need to either make our own state or join another state, you know, using West Virginia from the Civil War as the precedent. Mm-hmm. And the precedent's established. They can't go back on it now. Thank you, Abe. Can't go back on it now.
Right.
So you could do it. But the problem is, if you do that, if the right is successful in carving out parts of Eastern Oregon and Washington and uniting with relatively more conservative Idaho, who screams the loudest? Well, the Democrats, because that means the Republicans pick up 2 extra Senate seats.
Right.
Flip the argument. This is why I say we're back in the Civil War. Remember, the arguments then were the South was opposed to a ban on people from the South moving into federal territories and not being able to take their slaves.
Right.
And the North wanted to do that. So the argument was about who was going to have the most seats in Congress. Mm-hmm. And be able to ram their agenda down the other side's throat.
Right.
We're facing the same situation with all of this now. So I can see why certain factors or factions in the international and domestic financial community would want to see a split because they can walk away from a lot. But they've got to figure out how to negotiate this, how to negotiate through that minefield without creating a real mess for themselves called civil war.
Right.
But I think we're in great danger of it. I really do, because the parallels with the antebellum period are just too in your face.
They're driving the Democrats and the Republicans over the edge. There's no question about it.
Yes.
And they're underestimating the current pull of the current administration as well.
Oh yeah.
There's no question about it.
I think they're drastically underestimating Trump's support. I really do.
Yes, there's no question about it.
But again, by the same tokens, I think the Republicans don't realize that his support is softer than they think because of the way this coronavirus narrative has hurt his presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And he hasn't gone out and really done it. You know, he hasn't taken it on. He went along with aspects of it, and now that's come back to kind of haunt him.
Yep.
And we have those governors playing little fiefdoms, and I've never seen the governors act more ridiculous. Newsom, I mean, these are people. These are really. Sorry, Whitmer. I mean, these are terrible governors.
There have been a few sane governors, one of them from my home state in South Dakota. She just refused to shut the state down.
Kristi Noem.
Kristi Noem.
Yes.
And
she's done fine.
And she's done fine, yeah. I think half the reason there was, again, economics. South Dakota is a small state. It doesn't have a lot of money to play around with. It lives within its budget consistently.
Right.
Yeah. Abbott is facing trouble in Texas because his big pharma connections are coming out. So, that's what tells me that the softness of support on the Republican side is due to this whole narrative.
No question.
He's front and center with it. So, I'm with you. These governors and mayors are acting totally beyond their pale. And I think they're misinterpreting the signals from the public in a dramatic fashion.
No question.
I
think the LA mayor, they should just, go with a straitjacket right now, and put it on him and ship him out.
Well, my solution, let's dig up General Beauregard and place the cannons and, have at it.
That's how it's going to be. Elizabeth, it's great having you here. Fantastic. My God, we've gone through the space wars directly to the political situation. Of course, all of your work is at gizadeathstar.com. That's where people can get your latest book, which is The Tower of Babel Moment. I highly recommend getting the 2 books on the McCarthy hearings, which they are blockbusters, and they came along just before the Tower of Babel book. I recommend, this is the book that's really been keying me in on your stuff lately, which is Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations, UFOs, Oligarchs, and Space Secrecy. We're dealing with a lot of this right now. I really want to recommend that one to everybody. A powerful work, and of course your ongoing reporting and blogs with the news from the Nefarium. You do this weekly.
I try to. Recently I've had technical issues and storms and company, but usually every Thursday. And we didn't even get to the Three Stooges Dam in China.
This is true. If you want it, we can close with that, actually, because they're doing a lot of weather warfare over there.
I think so.
And you've been doing a series of blogs on this. And this is the truth about your blogs, is they're always ahead of the curve. So what do you think is happening there? And how does
I definitely think this is some sort of weather warfare. I really do. Because basically you have a weather system that's parked itself and is more or less stationary in the Indian Ocean that's feeding all of this going on in China. And I think Xi Jinping, he's not a nice guy, let's be honest, but I think he's been kind of blindsided by all this, because now you can follow the Indian news media, which is following China ever since that border fracas that they gave the Chinese a bloody nose over. Right. Indian news is going absolutely apoplectic over this, and what we're seeing happen is something very interesting to me, and it tells me that this is the weather there in China is a covert op of some sort, because the Three Gorges Dam was not well constructed by most people's accounts of it, and it's not a flood control designed dam. It's a hydroelectric dam, and the Chinese have already blown up a few dams above the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River just as a means of flood control. So they're putting more pressure on that dam. But you've got 400 million innocent people that, live downriver of the Three Gorges Dam, including the city of Wuhan, incidentally. It's amazing to me. So now you've got Indian media reporting that there's some real factional infighting going on in the Communist Politburo inside of China between Xi and his old rivals. And on top of this, what you're seeing emerge, if the Three Gorges Dam goes, it is going to be an instantaneous geopolitical change, which is already underway, even if it doesn't go. Because look what's happened. Recently, Vladimir Putin has put tactical ballistic missiles and deployed them to Siberia. And that ain't directed at Japan.
Right.
Russia recently suspended delivery of its S-400 surface-to-air missile defense system to China, while it turned right around and sold the same system to India.
Whoa.
And on top of that, India extended I think a $1.2 billion dollar, not rupee, line of credit to Russia, and has joined and indicated a willingness to join further mutual defense exercises with the United States and Australia. Japan has signaled its willingness. So I've blogged about the idea that what we're seeing emerge is a quadruple entente, recalling the triple entente from pre-World War I days. It's not a formal alliance, but it is an understanding, from the French word entente, it's an understanding that the principal problem geopolitically in the region is China. So I'm looking at this little Indian line of credit and wondering, is this something that is being done so that Swampington, D.C. can bypass its own sanctions, get money to India, and India turns around and gives it to Russia? Because sooner or later, that marriage of Russia and China is a marriage of convenience. I mean, let's be honest, it just is. So I'm wondering if we're watching big geopolitical changes, and they're happening at the same time as this flooding in China, and that tells me, it's weather warfare that's being done against China. And if it's being done, we have to stop and consider that the fact that people are willing to do it and place 400 million Chinese lives at risk to accomplish whatever nutty goal that they have in mind, that should tell you what kind of people we're dealing with. But that also indicates to me that they may be trying to press regime change in China, because if the Three Gorges Dam goes, that's the Chinese Chernobyl.
Yes. Wow.
That's the Chinese Chernobyl.
Do you does the closing of the consulate in Houston relate to that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it does, because there's the other stories that have come out recently that the U.S. Customs has intercepted shipments of automatic arms parts from China, destined, 10,000 of them, destined to a private residence in Melbourne, Florida. And there are people that were speculating that the Chinese were trying to ship these arms to eventually get into the hands of Antifa and BLM and so forth. And let's go further back to April 1st and that very weird coronavirus press conference that President Trump had. And the first two people speaking were the Secretary of Defense and then General Milley. Go back on YouTube and watch what General Milley says right at the beginning of that press conference, because he said at that time that the United States was in the midst of a huge military deployment in the Caribbean. Okay?
Yeah.
And this involved Navy destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, the Coast Guard admiral was there. And he mentioned, I think, the figure of about 6,500 soldiers. And the story being put out was this was a drug interdiction. And then Milley repeatedly said, "You are not getting in." Now, soldiers for a drug interdiction raises my eyebrows. Yeah. Particularly with that amount of naval and Coast Guard deployment, as much naval deployment that we have not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Amazing. I mean, they have the DAA for this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm thinking it's much more serious. I'm thinking that there's a possibility that maybe someone was trying to smuggle in a firecracker.
Oh, right. That kind of firecracker.
That kind of firecracker.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could the Chinese be so stupid?
No. No. But the radical left in this country could. I mean, look at them.
Yeah.
Look at them. If that's the case, they are desperate. And if they're briefing Nancy Pelosi and fumigation, a dirty bomb will do it.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's unbelievable.
So, that's just my reading of it. But,
it's important to see those types of elements involved. The fact that one got blocked. This thing about the weapons, I think, is interesting, because the last time you were on the show, you talked about these strange $1 bills that came in from China. This is a strange story also.
Yeah, it's a strange story, and let's not forget the seeds. What's all that about?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, why are people suddenly all over the country getting seeds from China? And why is the Department of Agriculture saying, don't plant them, don't touch them? You know, is this more narrative to get everybody to live in fear, or do they know something?
It reminds me of the anthrax scare after 9/11. It was like this weird follow-up. The seeds thing is weird, though, just by the very nature of it and using the Postal Service. That's another one of these things where if you can't trust the mail, you know, you get a breakdown in the society. It seems like they've gone after everything in that way. You know? Yeah,
well, I think, you know, we're not only in the midst of a real cultural hot war. I think we're in the midst of a real international covert operation of some sort. Between this country and China.
Yeah.
Mr. Xi has managed in 2 years, through some tremendous foreign policy bungles, the border incursion into India being the latest example. You know, don't pick a fight with India. You know, they got nukes too.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it's not the Indian Army of 1962 and Chairman Mao. You know, this is a whole different ball of wax they just tangled with. And you know, if they think Modi of all people is going to roll over and play dead, that ain't going to happen either. You know,
not by a long shot.
Not by a long shot. But Xi has managed to commit such egregious foreign policy blunders in the last couple of years. It's breathtaking to me. I mean, he's managed to do what it took Kaiser Wilhelm 7 years to do, to isolate and encircle Germany, you know, so he set a new record. So I'm just kind of mystified. And I think this is one reason he's facing some serious internal opposition, because everybody can see it. So, you know, China may explode. Who knows? I don't know. At this stage, you know, there's so much chaos in the world. It's not even funny.
That's what it feels like, which is China may be on the precipice. And the weather part, you know, if it hits like that, when you're saying that it would be basically Chernobyl for China, that's major, because
that's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. I think, you know, at the minimum, they're in a Chernobyl moment. And if the Three Stooges dam goes, you know, you're going to be dealing with a lot of very angry Chinese.
Wow.
and who can blame them?
Joseph, we have to have you back on soon.
All right.
Because we're going to go over all these things as they unroll. And now, are you working on a new book?
For the moment, no. I was working on the dark book, but I've kind of tabled that for the moment because the news is moving so fast that I can't keep up with the research for the book.
Right.
So I've kind of tabled that. So I've got a couple of other books I've had in my mind for several years to do. One being kind of a follow-up to The Philosopher's Stone, which I think I might go ahead and do sometime later this year, but haven't made up my mind. I'm just kind of waiting to see where all of this shakes out. You know,
no question.
Am I going to be dead in a FEMA camp by November 4th? You know, injected with gobs of vaccines. You know, who knows?
Right.
So I'm just kind of waiting. You know, trusting the plan and eating my
Well, if anything, you know, as long as you're on the outlook for us, we're doing a lot better. And so we really appreciate that. I recommend everybody follow your blogs because they're so informative. And I also want to mention they're some of the most plagiarized. But you know, that just
my blogs.
I
didn't know that.
No question about it. But it's been that way for a long time. I think you just gotten used to it. But that work is available at Giza Death Star, and also it is News from the Nefarium on your YouTube channel, and that is Giza Death Star Community. The latest book, everyone should go out and get that right on your website.
Yeah, it's right on the front page of the website. Just scroll down and see a picture of it.
Outstanding information, and Joseph, this is really the time.
Yeah, no kidding.
You've been writing about this for a long time, so
I've been writing about this for a long, long time.
Oh, question.
Can I
One
throw
last
in just
question.
one last question? Okay.
Yeah.
So, Joseph, everyone is desperate to red pill their friends and families because we need more numbers. We need people to wake up immediately if humanity is to be saved. Can you think of one effective book, video, anything that you can point people to?
Of my books?
Of anything.
Of any books?
People are resistant to seeing the truth if they are in cognitive dissonance.
I can think of a couple of books right off the top of my head written by an old style kind of centrist liberal Democrat by the name of Morris Berman. That would be one book. He has two books out, The Twilight of America and another one, Why America Failed or something. He's kind of a sociologist, cultural commentator. I personally enjoy his works because he is coming from that older traditional kind of centrist Democrat point of view and looking at the culture of the country primarily. And surprisingly, in that second book, Why America Failed, he has a whole chapter on the South prior to the Civil War, which is very interesting. The other two books I would recommend to people are Diana West, her book called The Red Thread. It's a thin little book. It's really a compilation of her blogs. And then another book of hers, a much thicker, much more substantial book called American Betrayal. And in that book, she gets into the committee era, McCarthy, the communists in Franklin Roosevelt's regime, which there certainly were. And she does a deep dive into all of that, and she does it with some very good, passionate prose. So those two books, I would say, of hers definitely get and pass around because the people involved in this whole effort to get rid of President Trump, Comey and Strzok and all of this, she goes into their backgrounds.
Fantastic.
And in every case, there's a prominent Marxist connection.
I love it up to date like that too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine that the CIA director Brennan's probably in that Marxist connection.
Well, in that second, or it's either the first or second McCarthy book.
Right.
I pull out, some of her research from The Red Thread.
Yes.
And start the book off that way. But The Red Thread is nothing compared to American Betrayal. I mean, she just lays it right out there, folks.
And of course, American Deep State by Professor Scott.
Professor Scott would be another one. Absolutely.
That book is from 2014, but it's still
hugely relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, the man did such a deep dive. It's uncanny.
Yes.
It really is uncanny. And he's to be credited for doing that, especially given his position there in California.
Yes. No question about it.
Absolutely.
Riveting. Absolutely riveting. Fantastic material. And Miss Olivia, you have some super chatters to say?
I do. I have a big one right now. Samuel Stafford, thank you so much. John
Thank you.
McKenzie, Michael Collier, Ben Dover, Irie A., Leshat, Robert Mathurin, Esoteric Gold, a cult fan, Wayne Peak, GDNPB, Eurythmia's Fun, Brandon Jimenez, Lisa Frequency, Joe Spindler, Cursacella, Viking American, Bobby Foxglove, Rick Time, CAB, and Alpha Warrior. Thank you so much.
Wow, incredible.
Someone in the chat just mentioned Anthony Sutton's books. Those would be good books too.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's that Trading with the Enemy book. That's a fantastic book to understand the whole setup of the things that you're talking about, that merging of corporate power from Nazi Germany. Yeah. Just remarkable. But I have to recommend your books the most.
Go right ahead. And please, folks, don't buy used books. spend the extra money and buy the new one so I get a few pennies. I really need the income.
Get behind Dr. Joseph Farrell's work, but the work is outstanding and amazing. Go there and select the recent book, but get your hands on this one, because if you want to understand what's going on now, especially if you're like me and it's the space part that really intrigues you, understand where it comes from: covert wars and the clash of civilizations, UFOs, oligarchs, and space secrecy. This is an outstanding book. I felt afterwards I understood the whole picture a lot better, and that's just because of the great work that you do on this. We really appreciate it. I want to recommend to everyone, I just put out the X-Protect UFO File Assassins documentary. It's about an hour long. It's free and available on my YouTube channel. That is the flyer for it. You'll get Howard Hughes, Litton Industries, the Pascagoula case, and your good friend, Admiral Bobby Inman.
Oh, boy. Oh, yeah, so many threads tie up there.
But I got a great inspiration because you've written about Inman. And George Joannidis and all kinds of strange kinds of stuff. But everyone, that's available, and I can't wait to hear what you think of it. We just put it out last week, and we'll do some kind of Q&A on it. Joseph, we're going to have you back soon this time, though, probably the end of August.
Okay.
Things are moving quick.
Post-election postmortems, maybe.
Exactly. But it's great to see you.
Good to see you, sir. Thanks for having me back.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a great one. And everyone, I'll do a few shout-outs here. Najat, Lee Veltman, Thomas Tyson, Scarlet Fire, Michael Gulpy. It's great to see everyone. David Donaway, outstanding. Daniel Natal, the man, the myth. Subtle Energy. Warhammer. I'm always afraid. That's a guy. I thought that was one of those names. Danielle Jorgensen, Irie A, Rex, fantastic. Michael Sartor, Daniel Natal. I know we had Carly out there earlier from Dimensions and Beyond running the blog. And of course, Gigi Young, thank you so much for being there. Kate, it's great. Miguel, Stefan, it's great to see you out there, sir. Great show. I cannot believe Dr. Farrell was on fire.
I got like 40 questions I didn't get a chance
Well,
to
we
ask.
will. That's why I said
we're
going to have him right back this time. But he had so much to offer tonight, and really incredible, being able to move between these subjects. That's the kind of mentality that we need right now to understand the situation and everything that's going on. Obviously, we're in a big, explosive political period. And what he was saying about, basically a President Buchanan moment, if you look back in history, that's really what a lot of this looks like. And so we need an Abe Lincoln to come in and take a look and clean up the situation. We are going to come back next week with a new X series episode. And in the meantime, get yourself on the newsletter. That's at darkjournalist.com. Sign up for the free newsletter. And all that happens there is we get you the newsletter once a week and make sure that you know what shows are coming up. There's some incredible stuff coming up in terms of guests, events, documentaries, the whole thing, and you don't want to miss any of it. So make sure you're on the free newsletter list, because with all the censorship going on, we know the social media, they're here today, gone tomorrow. But thank God we're still here, and we'll still bring you the best that we can. The other thing is get behind the show, subscribe to the show. We've kept the show really relatively inexpensive for you to join. So you can do that at darkjournalist.com. And thank you so much. We'll see you next week. Miss Olivia?
Oh,
outstanding.
Thank you.
Cruel summer. But Farrell certainly outdid himself.
He always
tonight.
delivers.
Outstanding. All right. So have a great night. It says end broadcast, but it never really ends, as you know.
Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks so much. Tono, I see you out there. And we will see y'all next week. UFO hunters. Hey. No hardcover books. That's interesting. Well, I don't have a book yet, but I do have the documentary that's available on the channel, and there's a link to it in the description of this video. Bruce Ross Morgan, outstanding. Bruce Ross Morgan is featured in the documentary, and his incredible story of his mom, Yvonne DiCarlo, and her relationship with Howard Hughes and UFOs you have to really dial in for that section. Wow, everyone's out there tonight. This is great. Jennifer
Thomas
J.
Tyson says, I miss knowing what you guys are going to eat. I'm going straight to the chocolate gelato.
That's great. Amazing Baby. I like that one. These are great names tonight. Gypsy Moon. Have a great night, everyone. We'll see you next week. And have a great weekend. Nicely done.